Okay, thank you, Nick. Thank you very much, Nick. Okay, I will call the meeting of the Santa Margarita Groundwater Committee to order. Can I get a roll call?
Yes, you can. All right. Now, everybody, please bear in mind that I just muted the entire room, so you might need to unmute yourself to respond to me. Director Engfer.
Present.
Director Leopold.
Here.
Director McPherson.
Here.
Director Cassidy. Director Cassidy.
I saw him.
Yep, gotcha. Director Franklin.
Here.
Director Pollock.
Here.
Director Dillis.
Here.
Director Ferris.
Here.
Director Henry.
Here.
Director Stiles.
Here.
Director Perry.
Here.
All right. For non-voting alternates tonight, Director Baskin. Director Brown. Director Koopman. Director Hayes. Director Lind. Director Moran. Director Eckwall.
Here.
All right, now I also just realized that we do have some folks calling in today. I'm going to go to the phones just in case any of them are directors. If you are calling in via telephone and you are on the board of directors, please state so at this time, please. All right, hearing none. Director Perry, we have quorum.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Okay, 1.2 additions or deletions to the agenda. Anything?
Nick, are you going to go first?
Well, I'm tracking my item is going to be 1.3.
1.3. So this is Brett Harmon. I would like to just announce and ask the directors to give it some thought and get back to staff, myself and Nick, with what if you have a viewpoint or idea or opinion on how you would like the board meetings to transition back to a different format, maybe in hybrid, maybe in person in the future. If you have any suggestions or ideas of what should be considered for this to happen, and we will schedule it for the future, most likely July meeting, for the board to have discussion, but your prior input would allow working group to digest it and possibly develop a recommendation for the board to consider next time. So there's nothing for you to do right away, but keep that in mind in the next week or two. Just communicate that to Nick Walsh or myself via email, not to the other directors, please. That's all from me.
Okay. Okay, any other additions or deletions? Okay, hearing none. 1.3, oral communications on matters not on the agenda. Nick, you said you had something.
Yes, I did. Earlier today, I was mailed a comment and asked to read it aloud, so I'm just going to go ahead and do so. Good evening, Board of Directors. My name is Christina Grandos. I'm a partnership specialist with the U.S. Census Bureau. I want to thank you as trusted voices in our community for helping us to spread the word about the importance of the 2020 census. Santa Cruz County has achieved a 65.8 self-response rate thus far, and we are working with the community leaders like you to raise that response rate by 10% over the next 30 days. You can support this effort by reminding your constituents that responding to the census is important, safe, and easy. We're hearing predictions about budget challenges that state and local governments are likely to face as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is critical that we achieve full and accurate count on the 2020 census to ensure that our community receives its fair share of federal funding. Our responses to the 2020 census will help secure federal funding for programs that benefit Santa Cruz County residents, including for water and waste disposal systems for the next decade. Responding to the 2020 census is not only important, it's now easier than ever. You can respond to the census in about 10 minutes over the phone, via paper form, or online at 2020census.gov. Finally, responding to the 2020 census is safe. All responses to the 2020 census are strictly confidential and protected by law. Thank you again for your support. All the best, Christina.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Anyone else have a comment? Anyone on the phone? An item that is not on the agenda, that an oral communication that you'd like to give us a little bit?
And if you're calling in via phone, you have been unmuted for this purpose. If you wish to speak so, please do so.
Okay, I'm going to assume I'm hearing none. Going, gone. Okay, approval of the minutes of the May 28th, 2020 board meeting.
I move approval. It's Ruth.
Second. Second.
It was Ruth, and was that Lou?
McPherson, doesn't matter.
Oh, okay. Bruce, thank you. Okay, any discussion? Any comment from anyone in the public? Okay. Hearing none. Do I get a roll call vote, Nick?
Yes, you can. Just as a quick side note, again, if you are calling on the telephone and you wish to make a public comment, you have been unmuted temporarily. Hearing none. All right. Going to roll call vote to approve item 2.1. Director Engfer,
Yes.
Director Leopold,
I'm going to abstain. I wasn't here.
Wise.
Director McPherson,
Yes.
Director Cassidy,
Yes.
Director Franklin,
Yes.
Director Pollock,
Yes.
Director Dillis,
Yes.
Director Ferris,
Aye.
Director Henry, might need to unmute yourself there.
Sorry. Yes.
No worries. Director Stiles,
Aye.
Director Perry.
Aye.
I have 10 votes for and 1 abstention.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, 3.1 consent agenda, proposed 2021 budget. Anyone have any need to have that removed off of the consent agenda? Okay, hearing none. Any comment from the public on the budget proposed 2021?
And if you're calling in via telephone, you have been unmuted if you wish to comment.
Okay, I'm going to assume I'm hearing none. Can I get a motion for the consent agenda?
McPherson moves approval of consent agenda.
Second.
Okay, that was Bruce and then Eden. Was that Eden? Okay. No.
John Leopold.
Okay, John. Thank you, John. Okay, Nick, can I get a roll call vote, please?
Absolutely. Director Engfer? Absolutely. Director Engfer?
Yes.
Director Leopold?
Aye.
Director McPherson?
Yes.
Director Cassidy?
Yes.
Director Franklin?
Yes.
Director Pollock?
Yes.
Director Dillis?
Aye.
Director Ferris?
Aye.
Director Henry?
Yes.
Director Stiles?
Aye.
Director Perry,
Aye.
12 votes in favor.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Okay, on to 4.1, informational session. Why don't I just to pass this off to Dave here to take us through, and then he'll be passing, and we'll be passing and passing.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good evening, everybody. We have, as we have had for quite a number of meetings, a very full informational session agenda this evening. We are going to be picking back up where we left off at the last meeting regarding groundwater elevation discussions, and then minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. It's a very technically focused presentation that Georgina has. Likewise, we're going to transition thereafter into a similarly technical focused discussion that will be led by Sierra Ryan regarding really returning back to some of the concepts of projects and management actions. Before that, as always, we are trying to maintain a constant review of the roadmap. So buckle in. We've got probably all said and done, probably about close to 2 hours worth of activities, including Q&A. We'll be doing the process exactly as we have been doing the last several meetings. Presentations with periodic pauses, me checking in, looking to you all for feedback. We appreciate the increasingly robust conversation that you all are having and raising and providing a record of within this process. I would like you to continue that, and we'll obviously be doing our best to get us done and completed at 8:30 as we've committed to do. So with that, Georgina, I'm going to hand it to you to take us first to the roadmap. Georgina, are you muted?
Yes. Nick, do you have the roadmap?
It's in the packet.
It is in the packet. I can pull it up if you wish. I did not have it loaded into this PowerPoint though.
Yes, please.
Well, as he's doing that, perhaps, Georgina, you can just sort of start narratively going through again. The goal when we're doing this is, as per prior discussions with all of you all, is many of you indicated that on a meeting-to-meeting basis, it's sometimes a little difficult to track where we are sort of oriented on the GSP landscape, the GSP development landscape, and it's good to be reminded of where we're landing at any particular time. So, Georgina, go ahead.
Okay, so you are all on this journey of developing the GSP, and I think you have now got a fairly good idea of the process, and we're going back and forth a little bit between different sustainability indicators. Nick, can you go on to the next one, please? So today here is the kind of a summarized version of the roadmap, and in June here, you know what's on the agenda. We've gone over that, but what's coming up that's important is that next meeting in July is going to focus on surface water. I think we're just going to talk about surface water and start to get into significant and reasonable discussion there, and also possibly on how we plan to approach developing the sustainability management criteria. And then we're also working on the groundwater model. We're nearing the end of that, of developing the historical groundwater model and calibrating it. So in August, we plan to provide you the results of that model. That would be how well the model predicts what's happened in the past. And if we feel confident that it can predict in the past, then we know that we're going to be pretty close on the predictions in the future, given the assumptions we make on climate and as such. So that's generally where we're going. But in the meantime, every meeting we have, we get feedback from you, and we rework some of these the criteria for the different sustainability indicators. So at the moment, we actually have a lot going on at the same time. We've got the water quality, we're still working on a little bit, and today we're going to focus very much on the chronic lowering of groundwater levels, and we will be revisiting that in other meetings. In fact, even maybe July. I said it would be devoted to surface water, but we may have to have a little bit of water levels in there so we can keep the ball going and we can keep things happening, because it's my goal to have all the sustainability indicators done by the end of the year. And the longer we go back and forth, we won't make that. If we don't make it, it's not the end of the world. We still have 6 months next year, but we would rather keep that for other things. So that's generally where I see us going on our overall roadmap. So you can see at the bottom, the model says it's 80% done, I think. That was a few weeks ago, so it's probably a little bit more than that now. So things are going well on that aspect. Okay, Nick, you want to hand over to me, or I go back to Dave?
Just before we're doing that, or as we're sort of doing the transition again, it's really important that folks have the opportunity to ask any questions. So are there any questions? Is there any concern or confusion about where we're headed, where tonight's sessions fit into the bigger picture? Again, there's nothing wrong with any questions of needing more clarity. It's really critically important that you as board members really are very clear on how this is all rolling out. So now is the ideal time to ask any questions. So are there any questions that folks have? Okay, hearing none. Georgina, go ahead. We'll transition over to your presentation.
Okay.
While Georgina is doing that and Nick is doing that, I'm going to give a shout out to your program manager, Perrette Harmon, who was a panelist representing your groundwater agency at the recent Groundwater Resources Association third annual Groundwater Sustainability Agency Summit meeting. She was on a panel along with two panelists from Southern California focusing on outreach activities and lessons learned. She did a fabulous job. Maybe some of you were attending that virtual event. If not, I just wanted to give kudos to Perrette for the great job that she did.
Okay, everyone can see, yeah, I was also part of that, and I'll actually mention it in this presentation. So today, like I said, we're going to focus on chronic lowering of groundwater levels, and we got through some of this at last meeting, but I'm going to go over it again because it was late in the evening and we were going quite quickly. So since this is one of the most important sustainability indicators in this basin, I think it's worth going over it again. Here we have the suggested reading that you could have. Same thing I gave you last time. DWR has guidance on how to develop sustainability management criteria, and this is the link if you were interested in reading up on it. Okay. So the objectives today for our meeting, and this is what I hope to get out of it. We're going to be looking at the next version of our statement of significant unreasonable chronic lowering of groundwater levels. And I'm going to go through the different approaches we could take for developing minimum thresholds and measurable objectives for chronic lowering of groundwater levels. And it's my hope that you will all provide some indication of a preferred approach that we could take, because I'm going to be giving you a number of options. And so just to get a feeling of what you think might be the right way to go. And so we'll be, those are the main two things that I want to achieve today in this presentation. So diving straight into significant unreasonable, we edited the statement based on input we received from you at the last meeting and also from email. And realizing this is supposed to be a very general statement with not too many details, we've taken out decline below measured historical low levels. So that would probably go into the undesirable results or something like that. And we've also changed it to be a bit more consistent with a water quality statement, or degraded water quality statement of significant unreasonable effects. And we added materially And we changed any to a significant number. This is based on feedback that we got from you all. So the next slide here is the same thing, but cleaned up. And I want to say something about the note. So this statement is going to change, if you remember, because we haven't taken into account interconnected surface water and groundwater dependent ecosystems. Those beneficial users are not covered under undue financial burden or impaired groundwater supply. They would get their own sentence that would be added on to the end here that relate directly to them, or sentences, I'm not sure yet. So just bear that in mind. I'm going to give you a few seconds to read through this if you haven't already read through it as part of the packet. And then we're going to pause and get some feedback from you on how you think this statement's looking now. So I'm going to quickly read through it myself, and then I'll hand it over to Dave at that point, because that hopefully everyone's read it by then.
All right, let's go ahead and open the floor. This has obviously been the subject of fairly significant discussion a number of times, and as indicated, it will change again. So drilling down to absolute specificity is probably not of the most optimal use of time, but nonetheless, let's go ahead and open the floor. Are there comments that people would like to make? Dale, go ahead.
No, I'd just like to chime in and say that I like this wording, and I'm in support of the statement.
All right. Any feedback? Any other further feedback or questions?
This is
Any
Jack
op-
Dillon.
Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, I like it as well. It seems to cover the two key things about impact of lower groundwaters, both from a water supply side and from a financial side. So I think it's a great general statement.
Great. Chris, go ahead. Chris Perry. Chris, are you muted?
Just saying that for me, I don't see the last part. I mean, if it was about my agency, I don't see the last part of it, the or cause undue financial burden. I don't see that as a get out of jail free card. Just because it might be an expensive fix that you have to make, it doesn't mean you get not to make it. That's not how I would read it for myself.
So your concern is that as worded, it may
No,
infer that?
I don't have a concern because I understand how we got here. I'm just telling you what it means. That's what it would mean to me. I think that's one of those things that, in 10 years, someone could have a vibrant discussion about it if someone wanted to use it for that. But for me, it really means literally what it says, and it's not a prophylactic from financial responsibility.
Right, and it is important to recall just collectively that notwithstanding that this board has made a particular focus, and I think wisely so, professionally, if I may, on commonly weaving in economic and financial conditions as a variable. It is important to recall and note that within both the statute and the regulations, as Chris says, that isn't a get out of jail. The goal and the law requires sustainability within a basin through one means or another, and claiming economic hardship is not an excuse for not being able to achieve and maintain sustainability. So that's an important thing for everybody to remember from a statutory and regulatory perspective. Eden, go ahead.
Can someone help remind me why the word chronic is in there? And if it needs to be in there, why it's in the first half of the statement?
Yeah, it's in there because that is what the sustainability indicator is called in Sigma. I didn't add that. That's the official title of the sustainability indicator. So you're allowed some lowering, but if it's chronic, that's not good. So that's why it's in there.
I asked the same question, Eden.
Does that that may not assuage your concern, Eden, but does it address your question? Okay, very good. Lois, go ahead.
Okay, I'm going on my favorite word here, undo. Undo is basically a financial term. It means unwarranted or inappropriate because it's excessive or disproportionate. It doesn't mean it's a get out of jail free card. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or feedback from folks at this time?
This is Jack. I have another comment.
Go ahead, Jack. And also, Jack, if you could, I mean, are you calling in by phone or are you online today as well?
I'm online.
Okay, so if you could, just so I'm tracking and being equitable with folks, we'll be using the chat box or the chat method, and you can just write the word comment and chat, and then that's all know where the queue is as we move forward. Go ahead, please.
Thank you for reminding me.
You bet.
Yes, relative to the Chris Perry's comment about the burden, the financial burden. Yeah, I don't view it as a get out of jail card either. I see it as an important aspect of this, and I view it as clearly we need to deal with sustainability. And I recognize it may cost us a lot of money, but for me, it helps kind of, if we're presented with several options and one of them is less expensive, you consider all the factors, but one of them for me is money. And so, you know, I might choose an option if it were cheaper and still got us to the sustainable area. So that's how I view it. It's as a lens, if you will, how to get there. But I understand it may cost us some money to get to be sustainable, and I accept that at some point.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, let's go ahead and proceed, Jordina.
Okay. Okay, now we're going on to the minimum thresholds and measurable objectives and undesirable results. And you'll remember some of this from last month's meeting.
By the way, it's important everybody be particularly excited about Georgina having discovered the virtual laser pointer, by the way. So I want everybody to appreciate, there we go, her having discovered that today. She was very excited before the meeting started. So
yeah, hopefully this is easier for you all to see than the pointer. And hopefully I don't get too excited and shake it around too much. Okay, so I added some extra things in based off comments that we received since the last meeting and during the meeting. I wanted to revisit quickly the sustainability management criteria and their relationship to each other. So minimum threshold is the low level where we don't want to go below that. If groundwater levels are really below that all the time, that's significant and unreasonable. The next metric is measurable objective. That's the aspirational part. That's where we would like groundwater levels to be. And we need to achieve them in 20 years, in about 20 years from now, 21 years, 20 years after we submit the GSP. And then we're supposed to maintain those levels, those levels at measurable objectives for the next 30 years. It's not always going to be there. It's going to fluctuate. It's a given. But then the difference between measurable objective and minimum threshold is what we call operational flexibility. So you don't want to be close to minimum thresholds, because if something unforeseen happens that you didn't plan for, you are suddenly below your minimum threshold for several years. This is not a good thing. And so you want to be up higher and that's why it's called operational flexibility. It gives you the flexibility if something happens to still remain above minimum thresholds. And then there are these little diamonds, which are interim milestones every 5 years. And every 5 years, we can revisit the minimum thresholds and measurable objectives, and even the statement of significant unreasonable. Everything can be revisited if we get more data, we figure out things that are not what we thought they were. Climate, something happens to climate we had no idea about, which is typical with climate. And so there's this chance to change things every 5 years. But what these are, we have to demonstrate to DWR that we have a path to achieving measurable objectives. And so that's what these are. And these will be provided, the model will be used to come up with these estimates of where we should be in terms of groundwater levels every 5 years. And we can update those because obviously the model is going to be predicting what the climate's going to be, and then we can put the actual climate in there at that point and see how we're doing, and maybe have to adjust it. So we're not talking about interim milestones today. It's just minimum threshold and measurable objective. Okay, and so if you recall from the last meeting, I talked about minimum threshold and undesirable results being very closely related. So when the basin is, when DWR looks at the basin and the GSP, it determines whether the basin is sustainable, not just on minimum thresholds. It is going to, it does it based off, are you avoiding undesirable results? And undesirable results use minimum thresholds in a numerical description. And I think and I'll give you some examples to remind you about what those are. So this one you've seen before, where undesirable results allow us to accommodate flexibility. So if you said, in this case, certain percentage of wells can go below the minimum threshold, that's fine, because undesirable results are a combination of minimum threshold exceedances. And so that's something you have to consider when we're developing the sustainability management criteria. It's not just minimum thresholds, it's this undesirable results. And I'm going to give you examples here coming up in the next few slides of what examples of undesirable results might be. But first I wanted to revisit this list. This is guiding how we develop the sustainability management criteria for this indicator. And all of these points I got from board comments, and that it's a good guide for us, and important for you to consider when I go through the rest of the slides. So I'm going to go through them again quickly. The groundwater levels should not be allowed to get worse than they have been historically. We want to protect against dewatering of the Santa Margarita aquifer because of its importance, both as water supply and for surface water. Protect groundwater dependent ecosystems, and we're not going to be, it's not factored into things just yet. We want to perhaps build wording into our statement of undesirable result that indicates a maximum rate of decline over time that would be undesirable. A certain rate is okay, and that again comes to the chronic lowering or the not chronic lowering. So, and also levels in some part of the basin may need to increase relative to recent conditions. Some type of recovery is needed in some parts of the basin. We're definitely doing metrics, developing metrics for each aquifer and in different parts of the basin. So there'll be several wells throughout the basin used as these representative monitoring wells, specifically for different aquifers. And if measurable objectives are set to increase levels, these must consider cost. So these are all things that I keep in the back of my mind as I'm developing, as I'm coming up with approaches and suggesting things, the way that we can go in developing minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. So now here's a series of slides. Oh wait, let's go back to this. Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I just going to cause so a couple of things before I even go ahead and open up the floor for questions, because I know you and I have talked about this. And since you've got it highlighted, can you expand just slightly more, because I know that it reflects a recent adjustment based upon the most recent feedback, what is meant by some type of recovery, like why that wording, why that change, or why including it in that way? Just to remind folks.
Yeah, good point. And I was going to cover it in another slide as well. So before I used the word recovery in the last presentation quite a bit, and to some people, and to myself included, when I first heard it for this basin, I just thought that meant recovering to the historic high levels. But it doesn't. It means some type of recovery, so some level of increased groundwater levels in parts of the basin where there have been a decline. So in the rest of the presentation, I have changed where before I had recovery, now I'd say increase. So I just wanted to clear that terminology thing up by changing the word.
And Georgina, again, before I open the question, is it, and I don't want to accidentally sort of overcomplicate something here, but is it fair to say that embedded in that some type of that phrase, some type of recovery is also the concept of sustainable yield, that at the end of the day, and this relating that's also to chronic, the term chronic, that at a bare minimum, the recovery's got to at least match the sustainable yield, thus making it such that your basin is recovering while still supporting the yield to be taken out of it. Is that a reasonable additional way of putting it?
Yeah, that's getting really complicated, Dave.
Okay,
but
then
we haven't touched on sustainable yield yet, but in general, sustainable yield is going to be where a yield that you can pump out of the basin without causing undesirable results in all the other indicators. That's generally how I would introduce that when we get to that indicator.
We will disregard stupid suggestions by the facilitator. So with that, let's open up the floor for any questions or comments that folks have on the list. Again, this is directly representing feedback that you have raised previously. So you should, those of you that have chosen to do so, you should see yourself in this list, hopefully. Let's go to Doug.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate your help. I just want, for the sake of completeness with respect to the GDE bullet, I wanted to make sure we also included surface water interactions.
Okay.
So, Doug, I have heard you bring this up a few times. So we also have to, the surface water interaction part comes more in the indicator of stream flow depletion. And so this one is more, you want groundwater levels high enough that they are protective of more the terrestrial groundwater dependent ecosystems. The riverine GDEs and interactions, that is covered more under the depletion of interconnected surface water. And yeah, there's a little bit of smudge factor, but that's between the two. But it's cleaner if you do it that way.
Well, I'll note for the record that on slide 6 we mentioned both GDEs and groundwater interactions, interconnected surface water, as items that we're going to address when we amplify on that statement. So now I'm confused. It seems like in one case it applies and in one case it doesn't. Right.
Yeah, I also, there's a little bit of a data gap in that interaction, and because and the reason is that, right, I think we're going to be heading towards a groundwater level proxy for depletion of surface water, and then that now becomes a groundwater level thing instead of measuring depletion of flow. And so that's why I say there's a smudge between the two, but we're not sure, and you're going to hear about this next month, of how balance plans to come up with the metrics for that indicator. So that's
Okay.
a little bit of a preview of what's going to happen next month. So yes, we're undecided at this point how it's going to go because we need to hear back from you all.
I'll be patient.
Okay.
Okay, other comments, questions? All right, seeing none, Georgina, let's go ahead and continue, please.
Okay, so now I'm going back now to this relationship between minimum thresholds and undesirable results. You got to develop them kind of together. You can't just do the one without the other. And so if you cut, this is just an example hydrograph. Groundwater levels fluctuate over time, and then you come up with, using different approaches, there's these two minimum thresholds. Which one do you choose? And what's important is that we word our undesirable result to be this combination of minimum threshold exceedances that cause significant unreasonable effects. And so if you chose here the higher minimum threshold, this is less flexible and more protective, because there is a greater chance that you will exceed it or go below it, meaning groundwater levels are below that level, and so that would be less flexible. You could be, if you say you only, 10% of the time you could go below this line, but this is actually over several years, and this is maybe 50% of the time you're below that line or whatever. So that becomes less flexible in avoiding undesirable results. But it is more protective because you're striving for this higher groundwater level. If you choose a lower groundwater level as your minimum threshold, this provides you more flexibility in avoiding going below it, but it's less protective because you're allowing groundwater levels to fall lower than they have historically. And then examples of how you might word your undesirable results based on different minimum thresholds. If you were using the lower, more flexible option, you would say, okay, you're quite far below the existing water levels or the historic water levels. We'll say no representative monitoring point can have its groundwater level fall below its minimum threshold. Or if we wanted to provide, and that would be zero flexibility there, right? Well, the only flexibility is that it's quite far below historic levels. A slightly more protective level, more flexible option would be to say, okay, it'll be down, if you had this low groundwater level as your minimum threshold, we'll still allow a very small percentage of representative monitoring point water levels to exceed this. And so we'd have to put in some wording to say some numeric description of what that might be. Okay, I'm just going to go on to this next one here. This is the example now. If you choose the higher minimum threshold, the higher groundwater level, and here you could say that that the levels are undesirable if they fall below the minimum threshold for a certain number of years, say consecutive years, say 3. These are just examples, at an average rate of greater than 5 feet per year or some other thing that we came up with here. And so that just shows you that this is providing for more flexibility by building in this wording, even though you have a higher minimum threshold than the other option. Okay, Dave, I'm gonna see if anyone has questions on these last 2 slides.
Yeah, let's open up the floor. Again, this is all seeking to build a common understanding of what this all means and the various options. So questions, Dale, go ahead.
So Georgina, I just want to maybe put an operational component to this, just to make sure that I understand, the 2 options. So the top line in the current slide that you have on the top line, the hydrograph representing historical groundwater levels through time, right? But what, at the bottom of that graph, don't we need to know kind of what were the impacts that were happening during that time? Were any wells going dry? Were people needing to lower their pumps? What were the impacts that were happening during those low periods? Because that would help me make up my mind as to, okay, that was an okay period, and so to drop below that or to come back down to that bottom of the hydrograph would be acceptable. But if there was wells going dry and significant operational problems, then we need to pick a line that was above that so that we wouldn't go back down to those levels. And then as I understand minimum threshold, then to me, a minimum threshold is a minimum threshold, and I would want to pick something that then would not drop below that minimum threshold.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
a great question. Georgina, go ahead, and then we'll move on to Lois.
Yeah. So we did have some discussion when we were talking about the background of groundwater levels over time in the past, and who had significant and unreasonable impacts when we were talking about that. And John mentioned that those people that did have lowered levels during the drought, a lot of them at that point, this is in the 90s, 80s and 90s, they deepened their wells, and we haven't had that type of thing happen to a large extent. The last drought, there was a little bit of it, I think, in some parts of the basin, but these representative monitoring points are mostly in the areas where we have data, right? And so that's mostly where the municipal production is happening, where your wells are pumping and both the water districts' wells are pumping. And so we do have a little better feeling for what impacts there are in those areas. In the private well areas outside of the municipal areas, we don't have the data to really know what those impacts were. It's just reports. And so based off our discussions that we had before, I was under the impression that the historic lows were okay because people have adapted since then, but we wouldn't want to go lower because people don't want to have to adapt again. I don't know if anyone else wants to see if chime in to see if my recollection was right there.
Well, let me first check in. Dale, do you feel like that spoke to the issue that you're raising?
Yeah, that helps. Just knowing that, because what you're saying is that we only have the municipal pumping data to go by, and so without the the other wells, which there are many of, the private wells, we really need to gather that data as best we can, or if we can't, then we're stuck kind of going with the municipal well pumpers and the data that we have, and that's fine. And we'll have to make the best of it from there.
All right. And so we do plan to put some wells into these areas where there is a lot of private pumping. We have got grant money to put in some monitoring wells, and those will be monitored. The agency is going to have to pay for the monitoring of those, but at least we'll have data going forward, and that's fine. We use best available information to develop the sustainability management criteria, whatever's available right now, and then we can refine it later on down the line as we get more information from these new wells.
Okay, thanks, Regina.
Okay.
All right, let's move on to Lois and then to Lou.
I had one question.
Wait, Lou, hold on. Lois is in the queue first, so we'll go to Lois and then to Lou. Lois, are you there?
Okay. Yeah, I believe flexible gives us more wiggle room. That's not very technical, but it'll help prevent failures and protection. The more protective ones ought to be based on some measurable objectives, whatever those might be. But there are different situations, as was just mentioned about well owners and things inside the basin, and it's a lot of things. It could be an environmental issue. It also could be conjunctive use, where you're drawing down on water to put water elsewhere. So I really tend to believe we need to be flexible. But I find myself also wondering if, since we don't necessarily have the same situations throughout the basin, and I know the word management areas has come up and nobody wants to do it, but can you make these objectives and various things the same for everybody? I don't know how you can just say it's going to be flexible, it's going to be protective, because it might not work everywhere. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so every area is going to have its own well or wells that you use as your gauge, and you can we can use one type of methodology to come up with minimum thresholds, say in Olympia, that will be different to how you do it in like the north of Scotts Valley, so you can, and you can have these different, you can have, because we know groundwater levels are going to fluctuate much more in an area where there's conjunctive use maybe, or where there's going to be ASR, aquifer storage and recovery, you might be able to, you would use different levels in those situations. And so management areas are, I don't feel, I think I expressed this last time, because you have the ability to have these different minimum thresholds, like the different gauges in all different parts of the basin for the different aquifers, that management areas are an added complication, because there's a lot of administrative work that goes along with the management areas. You have to kind of do everything separately. You have to justify, you have to have a whole different, you kind of have to have the GSP duplicated for each management area. So if you can achieve the same results that you are expressing by just having different minimum thresholds and measurable objectives in different parts of the basin, then I would recommend going that way.
Thank you.
Let's go to Lou.
We've talked a lot about using the term flexible as it relates to minimum thresholds, and that translates to me as a bar that's low enough to step over. Maybe I'm looking at it wrong, but the term that I think would be a better term to use when we talk about minimum thresholds is what I call a stretch minimum threshold. That is something that we believe we can reach, but it's going to take some effort to get there, because let's face it, Mother Nature is working against us. Climate change is going to be a real tough nut to crack in the future. And if we get dealt a hand where we have a lot of droughts that we have to experience that are going to affect our groundwater levels, having the biggest buffer possible is going to make it more likely that we can get through that. So I just want to offer up, instead of another term in addition to flexible and a hard point, maybe a stretch goal that is something that wouldn't be financially onerous, but is something that we believe we can do, but would take some effort to do, because we're going to need all the air we can get.
Right, and so there is actually nothing flexible about a minimum threshold. It is a number. But what is the flexibility part is an undesirable result, and that's your stretch goal that you're talking about. So that's the minimum threshold is a number, it's a fixed number, but the undesirable result provides for you to have some flexibility in exceeding or groundwater levels going below that minimum threshold some of the time. And so that the state doesn't come down and say, well, we're taking over the basin now because you haven't been able to stay above your minimum threshold. So you work in, a certain amount of decline is allowed. A certain percentage of wells are allowed to go below that. I don't know. I think that's a very general, to use the percentage is very generalized, and I don't really advocate for that. I like the idea of having allowing a certain rate of decline over a certain period of time, so you're not having this long-term decline. And so, but the minimum threshold is one number, and we can't. It can change over time if you get better data, like I've told you many times. But it's the undesirable result. How we word that statement of what is an undesirable result is going to give us this flexibility or the stretch.
Let's go to Jack.
Okay. Yes, I'm trying to balance in my mind a minimum threshold where we can be successful, and on the other hand, some incentive for us to literally improve the water table. But I keep coming back to wanting to be successful. And if I understood it right, we can adjust both the measurable objective and the minimum threshold, keeping in mind undesirable results over time. But I kind of like the idea of freezing them. And so will we have adequate incentive if we set our minimum threshold and our measurable objective, and then we march right along trying to make progress? I'm just struggling with what's going to give us incentive, but also show legitimate success. Does it make sense that we would, once we set these, that we would leave them alone? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So again, I'm going to go back to this diagram because it shows nicely the measurable objective. Like I mentioned before when I talked about this slide, we want to be up here at the measurable objective. We don't want to be down here. This would be the absolute worst. So don't. If we managed the basin at different well locations to have groundwater levels right along the minimum threshold, like you've said, and like Director Faris has said, this is dangerous because it's climate change. So that's why we would want to be higher up. And we have the model that we can use to see if we set a minimum threshold here. We can use the model to see, okay, given all our assumptions, is it possible for us to stay above this minimum threshold, given we have water that might be injected into the basin, and we might be using more groundwater in certain parts, all these things that we're going to build in to the GSP, what impacts does that have? So it's not like we're just blind, not knowing totally what's going to happen in the future. We're making plenty of assumptions, that's no doubt. But it's a tool that we can use to get some relative idea of how groundwater levels may change in the future. So yeah, I wouldn't want the water levels to be at the minimum threshold. So we might have quite a big buffer. If we put this right down where the minimum is, that gives us a big buffer in the event that groundwater levels, climate changes or something happens unforeseen that brings the groundwater levels down a bit. It just won't get to this level. But we also should be okay with getting to this level, close to this level, and maybe going down a little bit from there on occasion, not permanently.
All right, so let's try to continue. We are I'm looking at the clock. I don't want to hinder the conversation because the conversation has actually been really excellent, but I do want to be aware of where we're at on the presentation. So go ahead.
Okay. My favorite slide. Okay. So when it comes to setting these measurable, the minimum thresholds, we are looking for a standardized objective method for determining what they should be. As part of the GSP, we need to describe the methodology. So just looking at a hydrograph and just eyeballing and say, oh, I think the minimum threshold should be here. That's going to be really hard for me to describe in the GSP how we got to that. So generally the approach people take in developing these is to come up with some statistic. And so we've looked at 3 different statistics. 2 of them use standard deviation, and 1 is just the lowest historical level measured at the representative monitoring well. At first, I got to just explain what a standard deviation is. It can be complicated, but I'll try my best. It's generally it's a statistic used to tell how water level measurements in a well are spread out from the average. So I'm going to use this bell curve or a normal distribution curve to try and explain that, because even that simple explanation is complicated. So the bell curve describes the distribution of data in a data set. And it represents a probability. That's why there's probability here on the y-axis. There are two important characteristics of this curve. The first is the peak up here, which represents the average or the mean of the data set. So 50% of the samples are going to fall below the average and 50% are going to fall above. This is assuming a normal distribution of data, of course. So the standard deviation reflects how far from the average the data are spread. So one standard deviation, here I'm outlining it, is 1 panel in here. And this is below the average, but there's also here on the above the average, there's also a standard deviation. So in general, when people talk about 1 standard deviation, they're talking about plus or minus the average, right? So it's going to be about 68% of all the measurements in the data set are going to fall into this area over here. 2 times the standard deviation is 2 of these panels, and again, it's going to be on both sides, plus or minus a number of which is the standard deviation. So in this example, say you can say 0 is the average, and then each standard deviation is 1. So, but when we're using it to come up with something for minimum threshold, we're looking at a level that we want to be below the average. We're not interested in this upper part of the curve. We're looking at the lower end of the curve. So, we're just going to use 1 standard deviation here would be the measurements that fall into just this part of the curve, and that represents 34% of all the measurements in the well, or it's 68% of all measurements that fall below the average. And then the same with the 2 times the standard deviation, it's going to be about 95% of all the levels that are less than the average fall into 2 standard deviations. Okay, so that's what standard deviation is. And so the 3 different options that I've come up with for now is having 2 times standard deviation below the average level. So if you took the average level and you minus off 2 standard deviations, that gets you to a level that's a little bit above, generally it's a little bit above the minimum level, okay? And it's something you could apply to all wells. It's a standard methodology. The second one is just the simple minimum level in the historic record. That's got no standard deviation to it. It's just the minimum level. And then the third one is kind of a hybrid, where we're looking at 1 times the standard deviation below the minimum level. See, that's different. Here it's below the average level, and here it's below the minimum level. And so what this means is if say we allowed future average levels in the well to fall to where the historical minimum is now, then this 1 standard deviation would represent about 68% of the measurements below that new average. So it's just applying the standard deviation now to the minimum instead of to the average. But this could be also half a standard deviation, which would be about 19% of all measurements, or 38% of measurements less than the average. So it's just a smaller number than having 1 deviation. And so that is how we plan to use standard deviation in coming up with the minimum threshold. You could also use probability, but I kind of like this a little bit better. That probability is similar to this, and you say 95% probability. You see there's some relationship here. But this, I think, is easier for us to make standard across everything, given the different types of lengths of record that we have. Okay, I'm gonna see if anyone has questions here.
Yeah, can you hear me? Ruth has got a question, so Ruth, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm regretting never taking that statistics course. The standard deviation, is it always 34.1, or I'm trying to figure out where that number came from.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
These are fixed. Right.
All right, that answers the question. I'll go
All
for
right,
Wikipedia to find out more.
Yes, I'm with you, Ruth, proving once again why I became a mediator. Other questions? Jack, go ahead, please.
Yes, so if you did use a standard deviation as part of this, that means that there'd be a certain amount of the time where the measurements would be under the minimum threshold, if I'm understanding it right.
Yes.
And I guess, and so do we need to carve out something to address that? Because, and I'm picturing that there wouldn't be a whole lot of readings. Maybe it's once a year, whatever it is. And so I don't know how often it would get to something below this number. So I'm struggling a little bit just with the, what happens when it's under the, this minimum threshold set by a standard deviation? Is it just like any other measurement? We just, you know, it might be okay to do that once in a while. Do we need to factor in, you know, 3 years of readings, or can you help me understand what happens underneath?
Yeah, I actually have a slide that covers pretty much what you said there, right towards the end. And so that's, yes, that's where we use the undesirables result to quantify how many times you can exceed the minimum threshold without being undesirable.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
And so that's where we would address that.
Okie doke. Other questions? Let's proceed, Georgina.
Great. Statistics was never my strong thing either, just to be honest with you all. Anyhow, so but they are useful for this type of thing, I have come to realize. So when we come to looking at how to set the measurable objectives, we've got 2 approaches, and one is if there's no problem with groundwater levels, we're not trying to increase them, and we're happy with where levels are now, we plan to use average levels. And in cases where we need to increase levels, we cannot do that without the model. So we are going to have to use the model, which factors in the projects and management actions and climate change to see how high can we get groundwater levels given, you know, all the constraints that we have financially, sources of water, things like that, because it has to be achievable. Yes, we'd love to recover the basin to where it was in 1980. That might not be achievable given the resources that we have. So, so these are the two different approaches that we plan to take. And I'm going to stop and see if anyone has any questions on that quickly before I proceed to the different aquifers.
Okay, any questions, comments? Going once, twice.
This is Bruce McPherson. I might have asked this before, but how much does our lack of options to meet a severe drought, for instance, play compared to when we had the drought last time? And we did a fantastic job in meeting our, reducing our water use, cutting out lawns and doing, low flush toilets, the whole thing. We don't have that option, well, to the degree that we did before. How does that play into it? I mean, where do we go if we can't? We've lost some of the, where we use some of those already up. So does that hurt our, our trying to get it to a solution to maintain and not go below the minimum threshold if we don't have as many options available to us as we did, 20 or 30 years ago?
Right, and maybe you're aware of this, but even during the drought, there was some increases in groundwater levels, despite the drought, where other parts of the state had huge declines. This basin had some increases in groundwater levels because people did so well with water conservation, and so there was less demand. And so we are a little higher than we were, say, even before the drought in some wells. So that's encouraging. And Sierra is going to be talking about projects and management actions in the next informational session after this one. So maybe she can shed some light there.
Bruce, is your question that because the basin writ large has already employed certain steps in a sort of maintaining those, that by virtue of that, when another drought comes, if it's an even worse one, that there's just not as many arrows in the quiver? Is that the issue of concern you have? Bruce? We may have lost Bruce. All right, Rosemary, go ahead.
Yeah, I couldn't unmute. You're correct. Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. So that's the concern. It's not that the choices aren't there. It's just that the choice is already being used. So another big one comes. There's just less additional choices to get proportionally the same or better outcomes.
Right.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Rosemary, go ahead.
I just wanted to comment on Bruce's question, which is really it's about the question of demand hardening. And in our system, the Santa Cruz system, and in really the whole area's systems and water use characteristics, we have done a lot of work that has resulted in limiting the amount of demand management we can do in the drought situation. So it does make it more important for us to be thinking strategically and forward-looking about how we're going to augment supply, whether it's by conjunctive use or alternative strategies like the Pure Water SoCal kind of projects. These are the kinds of things that I think are really in front of us to help address and build reliability into the system, recognizing there probably is some ability to reduce demand in a drought situation, but fundamentally a major effort is needed to augment supply.
Thank you, Rosemary. Any other questions on this before we move on? Okay, let's go ahead, please.
Oh, okay, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because we did go over them before, but I'm going to point out some changes I made to the slide. So one where it said recovery before, I've changed it to say increase. And so now this slide is got this colored box around this part of the slide because I added this hydrograph here, and this is to show that the dewatering that has happened in the Santa Margarita aquifer. This wasn't in the previous presentation. Before, we just had this line of one well over here that didn't show the decline because it only was constructed after the decline. I found some other information of a well kind of nearby, added that to it to show that there has been the 60-foot of decline, and then things have remained down there, and that is why it's still dewatered. So, and little background on this, I'm sure you all kind of already know why it is like this. There was quarries were pumping the Santa Margarita. There was remediation pumping nearby in Camp Evers, pumping the Santa Margarita quite hard. There was municipal wells pumping the Santa Margarita. And there was this big drought. So one, there was a high demand, and then there was not much recharge happening into the Santa Margarita, so groundwater levels fell down. What I also found out subsequently is that in the mid-80s, the city of Scotts Valley switched to a sewage system. So that meant the recharge that happened from the septic systems was no longer happening anymore. So that recharge source was gone. So it could be argued that the levels that we're seeing beforehand were definitely augmented by the by septic system recharge, and now that is gone, groundwater levels have not recovered. Now, this is just a theory. I'm not sure. There could be there's probably other factors playing into this. And the reason why I'm looking at that is because that demand that was happening in the Santa Margarita is no longer happening. No one's really pumping it anymore. Maybe for Spring Lakes and for the ponds, there is a bit of pumping, but not the amounts that were happening in the 80s and 90s. So, you know, we need to understand why has it plateaued like this? Why is it not increasing? And so we can use the model to try and figure this out once it's constructed. We can do some sensitivity and see what we can do to get groundwater levels back up. Plus, we'll be using, for setting measurable objectives, we'll have to use the model to see, given the projects and management actions, how high can we get groundwater levels to come up in this aquifer. And this is the only area where this dewatering has happened in the Santa Margarita and that's because of the big demand in this area. The rest of the basin, we would, measurable objective, we would use average groundwater levels to determine what the measurable objective should be. I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, we got one from Angela. Go ahead, Angela, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of comment too. This basically goes to, in addition to what a few other people said, is, you know, when we're looking at these levels, you know, there have been some significant things over the years that have caused it to either rise or fall, like falling because of the drought, falling because of large developments going into the community that add users, and then also things to help improve, like going to recycled water. So, I mean, is that being looked at in these models, these significant types of events that actually cause things to go up and down? Like right now, I mean, yeah, things have been kind of level, but, you know, we are kind of having a housing boom in Scotts Valley, with some current developments going in and some pretty major future projects. So I kind of feel like we need to consider those things in these models as well. So I don't know if you guys have put that stuff in there or not.
Yes, the model does. It works because it's this accounting of water going into the basin and water going out of the basin. So the water going out of the basin would be this pumping to supply the users, new users, and there are projections of how much water would be needed for the future. And we know how much all these wells pumped in the past. All of that is put into the model. Recharge that we know of that has happened. That's everything we know in the basin that has gone in or out is accounted for in the model. Yeah, so don't worry about that.
Okay. Yeah, I was just concerned because, I mean, I just personally, I know it's impossible to get it back to be 100%, but I do feel like we should at least try and not just take the easy road out of staying at currently low levels. I do feel like we should try to make some effort, even though it's difficult and somewhat risky. We should make the effort to try to improve the situation.
Yeah, and you're definitely not alone there.
And that is definitely obviously reflected in your guiding principles. So that's quite consistent with that. Other questions at this time on this slide for the Santa Margarita? Okay, let's go ahead, please.
Okay, then moving on to the Monterey Formation, which is it's not pumped by anyone in the area where we've had the declines. And we've heard from Lois that it's a pretty poor aquifer. So small wells, private wells do use it for their own supply, which is small. It's able to do that. But in this area where we've had the decline, in the southern Scotts Valley area, it's not being pumped, so it's not really going to be targeted as a place where we would put water. One, it's a shale, so you can't actually store water in there very easily. It would, I believe that it's going to recover when we have the Santa Margarita above it, if you remember, and the Lompico below it. Those are the two most important aquifers in the basin. If we address those issues and try and bring those groundwater levels up, I believe that they're going to influence the groundwater levels in the Monterey as well. So, and the model will help us determine that. So that's when we add water into the Santa Margarita somehow and add water into the Lompico, whether it's just for storage or if it's, there's a number of options. You're going to hear very exciting stuff from Sierra later about all of this. There are some possibilities that we can do to raise groundwater levels even in this aquifer, just coincidentally by addressing the important aquifers either side of it, above and below it. So in the rest of the basin, we don't have groundwater levels. This is the only well, if you remember, that has groundwater levels in the basin in the Monterey. So we would want to maintain everywhere else. And I just want to pause quickly to see if there are any questions on this. Doesn't look like it, and I don't hear Dave, so I'm going to march on here. Okay,
I'm sorry, I was muted. I was already telling you to do the same. Sorry, I had myself muted.
Okay, so Lompico aquifer, we don't have to discuss this one. We did last month, and there we definitely are needing an increase. How much, we're not sure what we can achieve, but do our best. Yes, there's no easy way out of this one. We do have to increase levels in this aquifer. And then we get the last one, the Butano aquifer, and that one we don't have very good data for it, but at the moment we're looking at maintaining the levels in it. And previously I've shown you data that from the wells that the Scotts Valley Water District pumps, and unfortunately they screened in both the Lompico and the Butano, so we don't get a good idea of what the Butano is doing exactly. So we're going to put another deep well in that just targets that to try and understand that one better. Okay, so I just wanted to bring you back to this slide you've seen numerous times now, just to remind you that this is an iterative process of developing these criteria. There is no right answer. At this GSA summit that Dave mentioned earlier, that Perrette talked at, it was a conference where people were really discussing lessons learned. It was talking about the GSPs that had been submitted and what people learned from that. And overwhelmingly, people felt that they all had imperfect GSPs. They all realized there's no such thing as a perfect GSP, and no one's going to get it right the first time. So you should have no pressure at all that you're having to come up with the right number for minimum threshold, the right number for measurable objective. We have the luxury of having a model to help us look at future groundwater levels to see, are the minimum thresholds measurable objectives we're coming up with, are they reasonable? And we may very well adjust those numbers based on what we see in the model. And then again, we have 20 years to try and get it right. They gave us 20 years to try and get it right. That was very generous of them. And we'll take those 20 years for sure. So with that, I'm going to kind of pep talk there. I'm going to go and show you now what these proposed options look like when plotted against the data. And so I'm going to show you hydrographs again with some horizontal lines representing minimum threshold and measurable objective. And the first one is for the Santa Margarita Aquifer in the Quail Hollow area. And I have to apologize how busy this chart is. In hindsight, I could have simplified it, but the reason why it's really busy at first here is there are a lot of wells plotted on top of each other here. And I want to explain to you what a representative monitoring well or a representative monitoring point is. You don't have to develop sustainability management criteria for every single well in the basin. That would be just too much work, and it would be burdensome to everyone to do that. So DWR has allowed us to select wells that are representative of wells in that area and in that same aquifer. And so when I'm selecting representative monitoring points, I want to see what the nearby wells' groundwater levels are doing. I want to see if they follow the same trends as this well that I've selected perhaps as a representative monitoring point. And so some of these elevations are much lower. They are plotted somewhere down here or somewhere up here, using, at the same trend. So what we did was we kind of shifted or normalized, I called it normalized in the notes, but we shifted that so that it aligned with the representative monitoring point. The elevation changes within that well are the same. We just shifted the data to put it underneath this representative monitoring point so you could see, does this representative monitoring point actually represent the data? And it does. In this case, this is Quail Hollow. There's a number of production wells, and that's why you see these wide, big swings in water levels, is because they're pumping wells. Pumping wells are not good as representative monitoring wells. Sometimes we have to use them, that's all we have. But in a case like this, it's great. We have a great monitoring well dedicated, being monitored for a long time, and it does a good job of monitoring groundwater levels without these big swings in groundwater levels due to pumping. And also I should point out there's this dotted line. So this well actually only started at this point in the hydrograph. That's when the well was constructed. So what do we do here? Well, knowing that in the 90s there was this, that's where that was the end of that 5-year drought. Here, we know groundwater levels were low. So what we did is we synthesized this data using a relationship that we could establish between those other wells and the representative monitoring well here, and we created the synthetic data. If the well was here, it would be very close to having this groundwater level that you see in the dashed line. And at this point, I should have taken all this background stuff off because it is a little bit confusing. So just try and erase it from your mind and just look at this green line representing the groundwater levels in this monitoring well B. It's a Quail monitoring well B, and it's in the Santa Margarita. So then we have the horizontal lines here. We have the 3 options, and I use the same colors every time. We have 2 times standard deviation below average in the blue, the minimum threshold being of the minimum level that actually comes from the synthetic data here, and then the one-time standard deviation below the minimum level. Now, for this well, the standard deviation happens to be just about 10. And so 2 times the standard deviation below the average level is about 20. So that's 20-foot difference, but it's still it's about 5 feet above. Is it 5? Yeah, 5 feet above the minimum level. Then we get the minimum level here at 450, and then one-time standard deviation below the minimum level is 10 feet below the minimum level, 1 standard deviation. So that's generally how those different options look compared to the data. And then the measurable objective in this well is an area we want to maintain levels. We just took the average over the entire period, including the synthetic period, and we come up with an average of 474. So that if groundwater levels are around there, they're going to be above. Some of the time, we would prefer them to be up higher here and not way down here, for example, because that doesn't give you much operational flexibility. You can, of course, have it much higher, but we know if we did set it higher, that wouldn't be so achievable because there are years when there's less rainfall, and the Santa Margarita being very influenced by rainfall, it's going to have declines every now and again, and so we'd be off of our measurable objective. So in this case, the average works well. And I will stop and see if people have questions on this.
Well, so before we do that, the box up in the top left, is there anything more in particular that you want to say about that, or is that just not necessarily worth diving into deeply?
Yeah,
the table,
if I could read,
table.
Yeah, I guess if I could read it, that's just giving you a little bit of detail about what elevation the well is at and how big its screened intervals are, because again, when we select a representative monitoring point, you want it to be screened in the same area as the wells that it's representing. So that's the wells that we're plotting are these ones up here, and these are their screened intervals. And so that was really for me to when I was selecting which wells to be representative monitoring wells, I did that. That's not terribly important to you guys right now. It more is I want the focus on the method, and I want to hear if you need any clarification on how this is applied to the data.
All right, so again, as Jordina said, very busy slide, but at the same time, a very good view in a sort of an applied sense of when all this stuff theoretically then sort of gets applied. Hopefully this gives you an example of what that really starts looking like. Let's go to Doug. Question?
Yeah, thanks, Georgina. And I guess in terms of helping me suspend disbelief with respect to the choice of this as our representative well, I'm curious how you would explain to us, the difference in, the face validity of that well in most years is pretty good, but then you got that range from 02 to 12 where that well looks, a lot of the data points are below the line for that well. So it seems like that well is making things look better than a lot of people are experiencing. And if we have to defend this as a representative well, I'm curious to hear how you would explain that variance in the face validity for that time period.
There's a data error up there. You're talking about this period over here, right?
Sorry, no, I'm talking about the entire period. On my page, it looks like from about October 02 to, it's beyond the data error period. So maybe 10 or so. Yeah, where we finally kind of get caught up. Or maybe it's just residual from the data error. I don't know. So I'd like to hear the explanation.
There's no well's going to be perfect. And this well is very close to these pumping wells. It is one of the only wells we have that's close to them. There is one other well that we could possibly use. It's shallower and it's not really where these wells are pumping. We're not screened in the same level where these wells are pumping. And so this is one, the best option. And two, we don't have to be perfect all of the time. It has to be a reasonable representation, and most of the time it is. If it's off some of the time, that's okay. Realize that a lot of these are pumping levels. So in this period, these wells might have been pumping more. And I don't have the climate here, and I can't remember what the climate's doing at this point. But some of these wells may have been pumping a little bit more. These are monthly records. What we plan to do is to put in data loggers into all of the representative monitoring points that will give much better data on every hour of the day or whatever we want to set it at. So it would more closely reflect pumping in the nearby wells as well. So this may change. So some of it could be to do with when the well was measured as well. But if most of the time it's following the same trend, that's pretty good as being representative to me.
Okay, so if we had to defend this to the state, you'd assert that this is good enough, is what I'm hearing.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
If this well was 5 miles away, I wouldn't say it, but it's several thousand. I don't know, Rick. I don't know how close it is. It's pretty close. It's a few thousand feet away, I think.
All right. Other questions on this slide? There's going to be a few more that are going to look similar to this. So yeah, Dale, go ahead. And you must be muted. Dale, go ahead.
Sorry. Georgine, just a quick clarification. Did you say the data points on these wells were both dynamic and static data points?
Yes, the ones in the background are, but the monitoring well is a distance away and it's not pumping.
Right, but the other ones, they were taking whether it was static or dynamic pumping.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Seeing no other questions, why don't we continue there?
Okay. The next one is going to be in the Lompico area where the big decline has been. And here, again, I'm looking for a representative monitoring well that has a long record and is just the monitoring well, it's not being pumped. And the Pesian Tempo well #1 is the best candidate for that. The only problem here is that it has this big drop, and we don't want to do the statistics using this because the standard deviation would be huge because there's a big difference, right? So what we did was we took a subset of that, the lower portion of the hydrograph, and we did the standard deviation on that. But even that is probably too much because the minimum level is above 2 times the standard deviation. There is so much deviation in this because and it's seasonal, you see these big seasonal changes that a standard 2 times the standard deviation ends up being a couple feet below the minimum levels. So this one looks a little different, and then because of that, and then you have 1 time standard deviation is about, again, interestingly, the standard deviation on this well was about 10, almost the same as a little higher than the previous example, but it is still about 10. And this is an area where we want to see some increase in groundwater levels going forward. So we don't have a measurable objective based off the average levels because we're going to have to use the groundwater model to figure out where we can get to and what's achievable. And any questions on this one?
Yes, it will, Ruth. It will be on the quiz. For those of you that can't see Ruth's question.
I like a sense of humor.
But you will be graded on a standard deviation bell curve, so there's that then. So, which I don't actually understand what that means, but it sounded funny. Go ahead, Jordana.
Just remember
Okay, we better go on.
34.1%.
Exactly.
Right. So the next one
That's
is,
my sweet spot.
okay,
Go
this
ahead.
is the last example. This is one with bad data. We don't have much data here, and it looks like in the beginning, this is a Butano aquifer. There are two wells here that have this strange thing. I find it hard to believe that the Butano recovered suddenly 30 feet. I think there's an error in the measurements here. Needless to say, this well now has data logger in it, so this data that you see over here is much better. We're going to do our best trying to figure out a minimum threshold and measurable objective for it, but I think this is definitely a candidate for one that will change, say, 10 years down the line when we have much more data to show what's happening with groundwater levels in this aquifer. So currently our understanding of it is pretty poor based off this kind of data. So this is just an example of that. Any questions?
I am not seeing any, so let's proceed.
Okay. So this is my last real slide here, and this is now summarizing those three different minimum threshold approaches that you saw: 2 times standard deviation below the average, the minimum level, or 1 time standard deviation below the minimum level. And they're for reference kind of what they look like most of the time. And for each of these, we could, you know, depending on which one you selected here that felt right to you, you could derive an undesirable result based off that. So these are an example ones that I just put together, and these can change in all sorts of ways. Let's say you chose the 2 times standard deviation. So it's the one that's a little bit generally above the minimum level. You could say, okay, we would allow levels to fall below the minimum threshold some of the time. Now, I'm very vague there. We'll have to figure out how much of the time is appropriate there. That still avoids undesirable results or significant and unreasonable impacts, doesn't cause those impacts. So, and if we chose the minimum level, you would say, well, we'd allow levels to fall below minimum thresholds less of the time than option 1, because it's lower, and there's probably fewer instances of groundwater levels going that low. And then the third one, it being well below the minimum level, depending on how far it is below. If it's quite far below, you can confidently say never, pretty confidently say never allow levels to fall below the minimum threshold. So you 0 exceedances. If it was kind of close to it, say maybe 5 feet below, you could say, you know, very rarely it's allowed to go below, but it just depends on the relative position of the minimum threshold. So hopefully I've given you an idea of how you can word these undesirable results, taking into account how high or low your minimum thresholds are compared to historic data and also predicted groundwater levels once we start using the model. And so now I'm really hoping to hear from you which of these you feel most comfortable with, or which ones you feel not comfortable with at all, because I need to start developing these for all the minimum, for all the representative monitoring points. I've selected most of those, and I now need to start applying these to come up with some preliminary numbers that we can use. And when we have the model, we can then start comparing those against the predicted groundwater levels to see what does this look like. But I need a starting point, and so far, and right now, there's no right answer. I can't say to you one is better than the other, because as you can see, you can change things in the undesirable results. And And this is kind of a working thing that we're going to have to deal with. And we will have something in the GSP when it's submitted, but it could possibly change. And everyone I've spoken to on other GSPs have said theirs are very likely to change as well. So again, there's no right answer, but I'd like to hear from you which ones you feel comfortable or not comfortable about.
Okay, let's go to Eden, and then Doug, Dale, and then Chris, that order. Eden, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
I've got 3 questions to sort of figure out which one I'm the most comfortable with. Number 1, does it have to be one of these 3, blue, yellow, or red, or can it be some other permutation?
It can always be another permutation.
Second question, does it have to be, if let's say we picked blue or yellow, does it have to be that same logic applied to each of the different monitoring wells for different aquifers?
No, it doesn't have to be the same.
Okay. And then if it can be independent, is it possible to reverse engineer a logic where looking back over a certain number of years, we pick a minimum threshold that is just at where we would have violated it with our own history of unacceptable conditions?
I like the idea of reverse engineering, but I thought that the minimum level was that level of so the significant unreasonable where you're impacting water supply. We established, I thought, that the minimum levels that have been experienced in the 80s and 90s, it caused some issue with water supply, but people adapted, but now we're at some kind of status quo and would not want to revisit that kind of level again, or much lower than that. That would cause people to have to re-drill wells again.
Okay, thank you.
And so do you have an idea? Of which one
you're asking if I have an idea of which one I would be comfortable with?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I think I'm most comfortable with number 2, but I'm leaning towards reverse engineering some sort of variance from number 2 that doesn't go all the way back as the worst case test scenario to the 80s or 90s, but goes back to the early aughts or whatever, where there was a dip with a couple of drought years, and it'd be nice to know that, okay, this was back before we had done anything like we're doing right now to try to address these issues. It'd be nice to know that we picked a minimum threshold that if we went back 15, 20 years, we would have violated it. We would have triggered it just barely, so that it acts as a deterrent and an incentive going forward to do something more than just, almost nothing. So anyway.
Okay. But again, I'm going to reiterate, the measurable objective is going to be the thing that we're striving to achieve with doing things, with doing projects. The minimum threshold, we don't want to be down there. That is just kind of the bottom of the pond, that we really don't want to be down there. We want to keep our levels above. And this incentive thing has been brought up a few times tonight. I think that the incentive is the measurable objective. That's your objective. That's where you want to go. Given that there will be some things out of your control, the bottom of the pond is kind of, it allows it temporarily to go down that low, but we really do want it to be up higher. that's at least a general idea of those two, of those different criteria.
I mean, I understand that. I don't think the right analogy is the glass half full, glass half empty perspective. But in our extremely polar society where the taste for addressing these sort of things can swing wildly between election cycles from let's just do the bare minimum to let's spend a lot of money on it, it'd be nice to have an incentive or a stinger on either end.
I see.
That's the way I think about it. Yeah.
Okay. I appreciate that. I'll be thinking on that, ruminating over the next few weeks.
Okay, let's go to Doug and then Dale.
All right. That was actually a really helpful conversation with that as background, and remembering that the minimum threshold is what we're trying to do to keep the wolves away from the door, the wolves being the state. Couple of basic tenets here. Simpler is always better to my mind. If you're going to introduce something that's complex and requires people to go to Wikipedia to understand it, then there better be a darn good reason for doing so. And looking at the data that we've seen so far, I don't see meaningful variance between 1 and 2 in the levels that are there. And taking into account what the comment Dale made earlier about, and Georgina, you've come back to a couple of times about how the region has adapted operationally to these previously experienced minima. I'm gravitate toward number 2. It's simple. We can explain it to people. We know we don't want to go below it because look what happened last time. People had to drill wells deeper and so forth. And, you know, we can think about whether there's any temporal flexibility about exceeding it for a brief period of time, but you know, I'd rather see it as kind of a hard floor, to be honest with you.
All right, Doug, go ahead, please.
Did you mean Dale?
I'm sorry, Dale. Sorry.
All right. Yeah, my comments were going to be similar to Doug's actually, and what helped me was that statement that you know, we're picking that level that we're going to be comfortable with, and that's going to keep the state, you know, off our backs and allow us to continue to manage and you know, throughout this process. So with that in mind, and the fact that, you know, the levels that we had achieved before, the minimum levels, the lowest levels, and you know, historically, you know, we were able to adapt to those and continue on. But yes, we do not, you know, going below those would trigger potentially some undesirable things like, you know, dropping pumps and drilling other wells and having wells go dry. So yeah, I like number 2, and then also potentially though with a caveat that says, you know, yes, number 2, but maybe some criteria in there that allows it to, you know, go below for, you know, a period of time or a slight decrease, but then needing to see an uptick soon after. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Any response to that, Georgina? Otherwise, I'll move on to Chris.
No, I'm just taking it in. Although I'll say I do like that because it gives you a little bit of flexibility, a little bit more flexibility. I mean, being at the minimum, you already have some flexibility because, you know, looking at the data, you have been managed to stay above that since then. But it just gives that little bit of extra assurance there that you don't exceed or cause undesirable results. But you know, in the next 20 years, we'll be tracking the groundwater levels and all these representative monitoring points, and we'll be able to see, you know, how we do in the different climatic cycles. And so we have 20 years that we can go below that line. Actually, you don't have to be there until 2042 is when then we're supposed to be sustainable. You're meant to be at your measurable objective, and you should not be going below. So we have these 20 years to get it right. So having that little bit of flexibility now, whether to put it in or not, we could see how we do it, just saying minimum levels, or maybe 20 years down the line, we'll see, oh, we actually do need to have that little bit of extra assurance. I'm not sure. I'm not going to advocate one way or the other, but, you also have, I forgot to mention this earlier, that we have the 20 years to make sure we're at the measurable objective and that we're not anywhere near the minimum threshold. And then only after 2042 does the state start doing its watchdog thing.
Right, and for me, this is the safety net. This is where we don't want to be, right? And I keep reminding myself that this is where we don't want to be. We want to be marching up toward that measurable objective, and that's our goal.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to Chris.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that given the things that you put in column 2, after each of them, the only one I would be probably against would be number 3. I think the difference between number 1 and number 2 is not really that much, because there's a lot more flexibility in column 2 for number 1, right? However, I agree with what people have said so far as minimum threshold is a lot easier to explain, and you don't have to get into what a standard deviation is with someone you're trying to give an explanation to. You can just say, this is historically a minimum threshold. But I would also, at the end of all of this, Georgina, do you have your personal opinion of which one you would think would be the most preferable? I'd be curious to hear that after everyone speaks.
Yeah, I don't like to do this because it's up to the locals to decide this stuff. But I understand why you would want to ask me or John or someone else technical, is that I don't. And like I said, there's no right answer. I can make any of these somewhat similar in their outcome by just changing the undesirable results. But a lot of this is optics.
Yeah, I get that. Yes, okay. So I would,
but a lot of it is optics. So I agree totally with you saying that the minimum level is easier to explain, and it's not, and it's easy for people to understand. So on an optical level, I would say the minimum level. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's go to Gail, and I'm not familiar with your name, so I'm presuming that you are just not just but you're a member of the public. Recognizing that we ordinarily I'd go to all the board members first, but we don't.
I'm sorry.
Ordinarily...
Go ahead if you want to do that.
No. I think it's actually important. So let's go. We'll go to you, and then we'll continue on, please.
All right. I guess what I would advocate for is a mixture of, on the left-hand column, number 3, and on the right-hand column, the yellow. And the reason for that is that you want to give yourself some flexibility in terms of if there were a terrible drought in the next few years. And so taking one standard deviation below the minimum level is a logical one to do, but not that we don't want to set that as for everything. We want to say that perhaps that's a level that you would only allow a few wells in a given area to go below. And so that was a percentage. I think, Georgina, you said something like 20% might go below that. I'm worried that if we set the bar too high, we're going to, it's going to bite us somewhere. But I also, when I'm listening to this discussion, I just have this terrible feeling like we're doing this all backwards, because there's nothing magical about any of these particular well levels, and there's really nothing necessarily bad that well levels have dropped. The only thing we really don't want to see is we wouldn't want levels to drop so catastrophically so fast that everybody would be scrambling to make their wells deeper, and it would be very expensive. really all we care about is that whatever those levels are, they can be the low levels that have happened because of drawdown. Is we want to make sure that the groundwater dependent ecosystems are protected, that surface flows for fish are protected in terms of both the levels of water, the temperature, that the water quality in the San Lorenzo River doesn't have too many nitrates because we're not diluting it, and also the water quality in the wells. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we're spending a lot of time worrying about what to me strikes me as a terribly arbitrary number until we have the models and we can run them, and they tell us what are the levels that we need to keep these wells at to avoid any of these negative effects. And so lacking that, we might as well just set it quite low until we get more information that makes us think that we need to set things higher.
All right, thank you very much, Gail. Thank you, appreciate it. Georgine, anything you want to respond to what Gail said? Otherwise, I'm going to go on to Jack and then to Ruth.
No, it's just another perspective, and she's kind of right that the levels are they are arbitrary, although you are held to them eventually, and they're neat. I don't know, having it too low I don't think is good optically. There are known effects from having it lower. A lot of those other undesirable results or effects that you just mentioned are dealt with other indicators that we are doing the same thing. We're going through the same process with those, with water quality and stream flow as well. So interesting perspective, and there's some good stuff in there. Thank you, Gail.
Okay. Before we go to Ruth, or excuse me, before we go to Jack and then to Ruth, I want to just throw out a point of order question for everybody, not to answer now. I'm going to come back to it, but I just want to call attention to it. We're at 7:30. Our targeted end time is 8:30. This has been, as we had predicted, a very technically dense presentation, and there's another one that Sierra needs to do. Your input and involvement tonight has been excellent. I must admit to you that I'm concerned about plowing straight through to the next presentation without giving everybody a short break. But I am also concerned that if we do a short break, knowing how much time that Sierra and we estimate we're going to need, plus some follow-on final items, it's probably going to account for a bit more than a remaining hour. Plus, we're not done with this one. So I'm going to come back and check in with you all in a little bit as to whether folks are able or willing to maybe push the meeting out 10, 15 minutes or so beyond the 8:30 target. We're trying to do our best to hold tight to that and accommodate everybody, but I'm also concerned that if we go straight to the next presentation, folks are going to crash and burn a little bit. So just think about it, and I'll come back to it. Jack, go ahead, and then to you, Ruth.
Okay, I like having options, and yet I'm most comfortable with the yellow option, and it sounds like they all would get to the same place, and I certainly agree with the comments that easier to understand and easier to explain, and this is complicated enough, so I like the simplicity of it also.
Okay, thank you. Ruth, go ahead.
I'm liking the blue and the yellow options best because they allow to keep our feet to the flames while we're moving back up, but they allow for California climate and allow that exception when we have another dry period, and we know that dry periods are going to show up. And in the other question, yes, I would like a break.
All right. Seeing no other comments, let me double check. Hold on a second here. Let's move on to our last slide. We've got one more round of opening the floor for public comment as it is. Georgina, are there any closing comments that you want to make on the feedback that you received or we received? Otherwise, I want to go ahead and float one more round of public comment and then close this section out. Please, go ahead.
No, I don't have any other comments, but I appreciate everyone chiming in today. And again, we're giving you the option to, if any thoughts come to your mind, to send an email to staff on that so that I can consider that over the next few weeks while I develop the next iteration of this. And yeah, I think that's all I really have to say. Eventually, like I said before, we're going to come up with these preliminary minimum thresholds and measurable objectives for all the representative monitoring points. And like we did with all those chemographs with water quality, we'll do the same thing with all the representative monitoring wells, and you can thumb through to see what the measurable objectives and minimum thresholds look like on those wells. And I'll hand it back to you, Dave.
Okay, so Perrette, you've got a question, go ahead.
Just follow up to Georgina's. Georgina, would you like to set a deadline for those?
Yeah, I think we always do, is it 2 weeks?
So maybe Monday the 6th?
Okay, so we'll go for that. So Monday the 6th, close the business.
Yep, that'd be great.
Great. All right. So coming back to my question, Sierra's presentation, we estimate will take about 45 minutes. We've got agenda item 5, which we think will go fairly quickly, and then some final closeout items. I really do think it would be beneficial to take about a 10-minute break just to give you all a little bit of a brain palate cleanser, so to speak, and then come back. But I think it's going to push us to about 8:45 or a little bit later. Is there anybody that's opposed to doing that? Because the alternative is just kind of plug away here. Anybody opposed to taking a 10-minute break, knowing the outcome on the back end? Okay, hearing no constraint on that, let's go ahead and move immediately now to a 10-minute break. We will start back up at 7:48. So thank you. All right, let's go ahead and get started up again. Nick, if you could please start teeing up the presentation on PMAs. While we're doing that, I realize that I moved rather quickly and inadvertently into the break without calling the question one last time for any public comment. My apologies about that. So let me double back around us as we're getting things set up. Were there any public comments that anybody wanted to make with regards to the prior presentation that Georgina led? Again, if so, please go ahead and use the chat mode and just indicate that you have a comment or a question. So we'll just check in one last time very quickly on that. Any public comments?
As an additional note here, if you're calling in via telephone, you're currently unmuted. If you want to speak at this time, this is your opportunity.
Thank you, Nick. All right, hearing none and seeing none, we will move straight on to Sarah and a presentation about PMAs. Go ahead, Sarah.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I do think that this is going to be an interesting conversation, and I do not have any talk of standard deviations whatsoever in this presentation, so I hope you are all happy about that. So let's set a little bit of an kind of background and expectation management for the talk on projects and management actions today. You haven't really heard about projects and management actions in this basin since the educational series that took place back in early last year. So this isn't a new conversation, but it's one that we haven't had for a long time. So I'm going to treat it as if it's not review. What I'm going to be going through today is kind of introducing you to the tools in your project and management action toolbox and trying to help you relate how these tools can help you reach the sustainability management criteria that we've been spending so much time talking about. And then I'll be interested in hearing your feedback about if there's anything in here that you think is really great or really terrible. That's kind of the level of feedback that we're looking for. And then I'm going to go through some of the next steps, and the next steps are where we really get into the detailed evaluation. So this is going to be a little bit more high level than that. And I'm not. Oops, there we go. All right, so what are PMAs? PMAs are project and management actions. It's just another one of your semantics, as Dave likes to call them. How they fit into this bigger picture is, right now we've been working on these sustainable management criteria for a long time. They are kind of the what. What are we trying to achieve? The projects and management actions are how we are going to achieve them. They are what we will do to get us to those, to meet those criteria. And they can also be thought of as ways to increase water supply or improve efficiencies within systems. So when we talk about them, that's what we're talking about. And this is going to show up in section 4 of the GSP. That's where this belongs. So I want to, familiarize you with the landscape within which this conversation is already happening. We already have projects and management actions in place in this basin. We have for a long time. As both Bruce and Rosemary have alluded to, there's already a lot of water use efficiency and water conservation that's happening kind of across the board. There's also recycled water, non-potable recycled water being used by Scotts Valley Water District for irrigation purposes. There are 3 stormwater capture and recharge projects already in place in the basin. The San Lorenzo Valley Water District has been using conjunctive use management for their north system on an ongoing basis. And then we also have surface water storage in the form of Loch Lomond and its relationship with the Felton Diversion that are both managed by the city of Santa Cruz. So this isn't an area where nothing has been done yet. There's also been a lot of work over the past many decades to evaluate other potential water supply projects. These are some that have already been evaluated and in many ways have been removed from the table. So we're not going to be talking about these in the ongoing discussion. So some of those include additional surface water storage, such as the Ziente Dam, raising the Loch Lomond Dam, quarry storage, and then also these water use restrictions, which have run into issues in the past, although I think it's really important to note that that is the tool the state will use if we need to, if they feel they need to intervene, they will just mandate water use restrictions and charge people for the use of water and moving forward. So these are no longer really projects that I want to talk about, but I wanted to make sure that you were aware that they have been evaluated already. So if you don't hear them come up later on in the presentation, this is why. And then I see we have a pause, Dave, if you wanted to ask if anyone had any questions.
Yeah, so we're just going to use the same approach. Anybody got any immediate questions about the surface storage topic? I know that this has been a question that has come up from members of the public and the viability of using these quarry areas. So we wanted to just double check back in on that. Nope, not seeing any. So let's go ahead, Sierra.
All right, great. So now let's talk about the projects and management actions that are being considered. You would have seen on the website, there's where the presentation and all the packet information is, there's a document that outlines 24 projects and management actions that are in various stages of development in the basin. And it does include those ones that are no longer being considered, because I think it's important to make sure that it's recognized that they have been evaluated. You're going to see that some of the project components show up in multiple different iterations and different project and management options, because it really is different ways to apply tools. And some of them are conceptual. So some of these are currently being investigated, or some of them are already implemented. Some of them are being evaluated and are in various levels of that evaluation. And that's all noted on the form. So it just means that there's more work that's been done. Some of the ones that are already in sort of a studying phase have had some more background work, but there's possibilities with the conceptual projects as well. And I just want to be clear that this is a working document. It says draft across it, and it's expected to change over time, and that's fine. So I want to talk a little bit about flexibility when it comes to choosing projects. I don't want you to feel that we're going to talk about projects and we have to agree on one that's going to solve every problem in the basin, because that's not the way this is likely to unfold. We have the opportunity to build in flexibility and to address uncertainty. I'm sure all of you, being in the water resources management world, are already comfortable with planning in light of uncertainties. And so we're given the opportunity, the way we structure our projects, to consider that. So for example, this is a generic basin approach using a tiered project system. So you have your group 1 baseline projects. These are the projects that are already happening in the basin that you expect to continue moving forward. In this example, it would be water conservation, pumping redistribution, and conjunctive use, and the various agencies are already implementing them and plan to implement them moving forward. And then this basin would have their actual plan to reach sustainability. So they have their sustainability management criteria, and they have these 3 projects, and they're pretty sure that by implementing these 3 projects based on what they know now, they think they will be able to reach and maintain sustainability for the next 50 years. However, we know that there are things that can change unexpectedly in a 50-year time frame, so it's important that it's possible to say, okay, we think we're going to get there with these group 2 projects. These are what we're planning for. These are how we're planning to move forward, but maybe we want to keep these other things, in the queue just in case we need to reassess in 15 years. We can use something like this too in this basin. So I hope that makes you feel a little bit more comfortable in the planning. It's a lot of pressure, but we can build in some flexibility over time. All right, let's dive into the project types. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to go through each of these different project types, and I'm going to pause after each one to see if there's any questions. I really encourage you, even though I know it's getting late, to ask questions now, because it's going to be important that everybody understands these project types and how they can be applied and how they can connect to each other, and how it relates to both water supply and sustainability management criteria in the basin. So if you have questions, please do ask them now. Let's start with stormwater recharge. So stormwater recharge, at its most basic explanation, is just facilitating infiltration of stormwater into the groundwater basin. This can be done a number of different ways. You can have a surface water. Do I have my laser? I do have. Here's my laser. So this drawing here shows a surface water infiltration system where you basically have storm drains all collecting into this one basin, which is connected hydrologically. There's no impervious surface here, or impervious zone that the water can't infiltrate through. So the water is just able to percolate into the groundwater. Over here, we have a system of dry wells. This is a great system to use if you don't have the space for a large basin, or if you have some sort of layer that prevents infiltration. So it could be clay layer, it could even be pavement. I've seen examples of, in Southern California, them putting in dry wells along the roads. Some important things to understand about these stormwater recharge projects is that the water is not being recharged directly into the groundwater. It's infiltrating into this unsaturated zone. There's also some pretreatment. The systems are designed to have some level of pretreatment, but it's not the same as like a mechanical filtration system like you would have for potable water. So this is slightly cleaned up stormwater. It's not potable water. It's not getting recharged into the groundwater aquifer. It's just making it into this unsaturated zone below the surface and allowed to make its way down into the water table. So that is a really important distinction. It's also a passive system. So the rate of infiltration is really determined by the soil types. The sandier, the looser the soil types are, the easier the water will be able to infiltrate, so the faster it will be able to go.
Sierra, we've got a question from Lois, if you're ready to take a question yet.
Yeah, I could take it now.
Go ahead, Lois. You may need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Could I go back a page where you refer to Agency 1, Agency 2, and Agency 3? Does that mean anything?
No, this doesn't mean anything. This was just a way of showing the way multiple agencies could work together in a GSP by doing projects either
Okay,
individually
so
or
naming
together.
anybody. So,
It's purely hypothetical.
so groundwater recharge, you're really talking about if there's built-in systems to catch that water that's the storm water. How much does stormwater, okay, like here where I live and we get heavy rain and we've had too much rain, it just all runs off. But a lot of it goes into Lompico Creek, which eventually might go out to the ocean, which doesn't do us any good, but still it must help with surface water at somewhere along the line.
So yes, what you're talking about, are you talking about, is there a way to capture that water even once it's ended up into the surface water systems? Or are you asking if it has a benefit just in and of
I mean, there probably is a way, but we don't have a way right now. I'm just saying it does run down like Lake Boulevard where I live. It runs down the road and it goes into Lompico Creek.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we have culverts along the road that puts the water into the creek. But how much does that do any good? Does it help surface water and the groundwater as it passes on its way all the way down to the ocean?
Yeah, so that is an important issue with stormwater. If you're if the water that you're taking for these capture and recharge projects is somehow going to be important to the surface water system, and what that mostly is referring to is fish passage related things. If you take so much of the runoff out of the system that it's not making it into the creek, you might impact fish passage systems. That's very unlikely that we'd be able to build the amount of projects where that would be a concern. However, any project that you would build where you'd be taking water that would end up that could potentially be put to beneficial use by the environment, that's part of the permitting consideration. So you're right, it is something that we would definitely need to evaluate. We couldn't take away the water that was entering the system if that water was providing a beneficial use already into the surface water. Realistically, most of that water is not going to end up in the groundwater table once it ends in the creek. It's just going to be moving very quickly. But that is a really important consideration, and thank you for bringing it up.
But Lois, I want to make sure. It sounds to me like you are also asking, like, when those conditions occur, those main water rain events occur, what kind of beneficial recharge condition is actually occurring as the water is sort of on its way from surface water runoff from like sort of non-point source runoff directly into a tributary. I think you're asking what kind of benefit can be gained in the groundwater system. Is that right?
Yes, I am.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that I think even in the context of what you've got here, Sarah, I think the question that Lois is asking is, absent some passive, but albeit, still built concept, to try to enhance that capture and recharge, how much on the natural, if you will, recharge are you getting?
Yeah, so that's an issue that is really important to project siting. So if we would be really unlikely to try to build a recharge project like this in an area that's already got a lot of open space and available recharge zone that's already functioning. You know, the system was, when it was evolving, it naturally provided recharge into the groundwater basin, and much of the upper part of the basin where it's not so, where there's less development, there's already natural recharge occurring. So those would be areas where it would not make as much sense to develop a project because the benefits wouldn't really pencil out. So the areas we'd really focus on for doing a recharge project like this are areas where you don't have that natural recharge already occurring, because either there's a natural impermeable area, which isn't such a big concern in this basin. We don't have a big clay layer like we do in some other parts of the county, or in areas where there's already been a lot of development.
John, did you want to weigh in and further expand on the response that Sierra just gave?
Yeah, I was just going to add a little bit to that. I mean, Sierra is correct. Where we have the rainfall sort of in the upper watershed that soaks into the ground, that does benefit the streams and the summer base flow. But once that water sort of hits the road, like hits Lake Boulevard and hits the culvert and hits Lompico during a storm event, it's pretty much headed out to the ocean, and we're not going to get much benefit with it. The other thing is, once it's becomes sort of that stormwater runoff, it may have a lot of sediment and other pollutants in it, so it's not really even available to. It's not very good to divert further on. It pretty much just have to let that go. We do try to minimize that runoff as much as possible and capture it and have it soak into the ground, even just on individual home sites. But once it hits the culverts, it's pretty much on its way to the ocean.
All right.
Okay, let's proceed if we could. Sierra, thank you.
All right, so now I'm going to show you how this works from the kind of hydrogeologic perspective. These arrows represent stormwater that these projects would benefit the Santa Margarita aquifer, because that's where the stormwater would go. Remember, by their nature, stormwater recharge projects don't go into the saturated zone. They're only in the unsaturated zone, which really limits their utility to the Santa Margarita aquifer, because that's where we can place them. The way this connects to the sustainability management criteria, you're going to see where you have these projects in place, you could see improved groundwater levels in the Santa Margarita aquifer, an improvement in groundwater storage, and an improvement in the depletion of interconnected surface waters and the link to groundwater dependent ecosystems, again, because those systems are most likely connected to the Santa Margarita aquifer. The water quality impacts are kind of one of the bigger concerns with these types of projects. You have to make sure that the water that you're recharging, because you are removing some of the natural filtration, you have to make sure that the water is clean enough to put into the ground. So that's something that you have to monitor. So that's how stormwater recharge projects kind of relate to the sustainability management criteria. But I think it's important to put this in perspective into what kind of benefits can we really see. These projects are typically not very expensive on the spectrum of water-related projects, but the cost per acre foot can be really high because you don't get a lot of water per project. You might have a project that's $300,000, but you might only be getting 9 acre feet a year out of it. And this is also not a very reliable water supply for a number of reasons. One, it's completely dependent on runoff, which is dependent on, number one, rain, but also other factors like how much rain has happened previously. Is the rain soaking in, or is it running off? And then there's also the uncertainty about where the water goes once it's infiltrated. So you can put it in the Santa Margarita aquifer, but does that mean it's going to be getting to where it can be utilized by either private well owners or by maybe the San Lorenzo Valley Water District and some of their more northern systems, although that's not probably where we would cite these projects? Or is it really going to be running off into the creek, which there's obviously benefits for slowing the water down, sinking it a little bit and having it percolate into the creeks at a lower rate. But, you know, we need to make sure through modeling that we really are seeing some benefits of these projects before we put them in. And then, like I said, the scale of these projects is just not very big. Scotts Valley Water District did put in 3 projects, like I mentioned before, and those 3 together did infiltrate 83 acre-feet a year over a 3-year period. So it's not nothing, and I really want to be careful how I phrase this, because I think it is a really valuable tool. I think recharge has a lot of potential, and it can create a lot of benefit, but also it's not going to be the solution to the problem in this basin, just because of the scale you can get, and that it's really pretty limited to just the Santa Margarita aquifer. All right, so I'm ready to move on. Are there any other questions related to stormwater recharge?
Chris, go ahead.
I just wanted to add something that I'm sure we've heard before, but just to remember that because of the new requirements from the state, anything that's built nowadays is automatically doing these kind of recharge components to them. So even though a water district or a city or an agency might not be doing them, they're being put in with all new building projects. So little by little, there's an entire network of these throughout the county and throughout this, our region. Certainly the Regional Water Quality Board of Region 5, I think, what are we?
Region 3.
Central Coast.
Yes,
Region
that
is certainly, doing widely, and I think that's something that we could probably get a pretty good record of how many of those exist at this point, because there's quite a few of them, and there'll be more and more.
Yes, no, that is absolutely true. This is something that is happening with new development. New development has to create the same amount of recharge on site that the pre-development condition would have been. I actually heard of someone very recently putting in a project in the Aptos area where they put in a dry well, the same type of dry well that we're planning to put in the Seascape area in a couple months. So it is happening already on its own. All right, so moving on. Okay, next I'm going to talk about water transfers for in lieu or passive recharge. And this project type has been called water transfers, in lieu recharge, and passive recharge, depending on what you're reading and who wrote it. So I included all of them in the title. So if you hear any of these phrases, this is the type of project that it's referring to. So the way these projects work is you have System 1 over here. They have a lot of surface water. In fact, during the winter and spring, they have more surface water available to them than they can use and that for water supply, and that is necessary for ecosystem protection. And their neighbors to the east over here, System 2, are solely using groundwater for all of their needs all year round. And so System 1 can transfer some of that water to System 2, some of that excess surface water, allowing System 2 to use less of the groundwater. That in turn creates an opportunity. It's an in lieu water transfer, so they're using surface water from System 1 in lieu of groundwater from their own wells, and that allows those wells to passively recharge because you're not adding water to the system, but there's already water being recharged just through natural processes. So if we were to do something like that here, how would it look to the aquifer? Well, like I said, it's not adding water to the system, but it's reducing pumping from the system, allowing groundwater levels to increase. And these projects, in lieu recharge, when we talk about them moving forward, we're really probably going to be focusing on projects that would benefit the Lompico aquifer, just because of the nature of where we have the biggest declines in pumping, and the San Lorenzo Valley Water District already addresses a lot of their pumping in the Santa Margarita with conjunctive use that I'll be talking about soon. So that's assuming that any projects that would be looking at these types of water transfers would benefit the Lompico aquifer, you would see improved groundwater levels, improved groundwater levels in the Lompico aquifer because less water would be being extracted. That would all in turn improve groundwater storage. And those are kind of the two that we'd be focusing on, the two of the sustainability management criteria that would be benefited by this. Although I think it's important to mention that it also provides water supply security. So just in terms of an evaluation of these types of projects, they are fairly low cost in comparison to some of the other bigger water supply projects that we're going to talk about, because the main costs are infrastructure, although there could be, depending on the source of the surface water and the condition of the pipes where the water is being transferred to, there could be some water quality. It wouldn't impact the groundwater water quality, but in terms of just making sure that the customers don't notice a difference, that's something that would be important to evaluate. And the scale of project for these kind of water transfers, it's limited by the demand of the system receiving the water. So what that means, going back to this little drawing that we have over here, if system 1 has like 300 acre-feet of excess surface water for a 4-month period, but system 2 is only going to use 100 acre-feet, they're limited, the project scope is limited to 100 acre-feet because that's the amount of water that system can take. It's just an in lieu process. Again, any sort of, we've heard concerns about future climate change scenarios, and these projects would rely on surface water as a source. So there's potential that may be less reliable in the future than it has been historically, although I don't know that we can say that for sure yet. And this could be part of a conjunctive use project that I'm going to talk about in a minute, or a standalone project if there's no expectation to recover that recharged water. So if I'm ready to take questions on this now, are there questions for water transfers in the in lieu recharge?
Any questions? All right, I'm not seeing any, so let's proceed.
Okay.
Oh, wait,
So
go.
next,
Doug Engfer, quick on the draw. Doug, go ahead.
Snuck in, just under the wire. Pierre, is it also possible that there are water rights issues attendant on this, if there are place of use considerations?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. If the source of the water that you want to transfer, and in a real world example of this, there's been the San Lorenzo Valley Water District, in the grant that we've been working on with them, has looked at some of the availability of Fall Creek and being able to potentially transfer excess water to other parts of their systems during the winter when they have excess water there, and then be able to use other parts of the systems to offset that system in the fall. But right now that project, that source of water, Fall Creek, is limited to being able to be used in Felton. So it's limited by its water rights and place of use. So absolutely that's a consideration. And that same consideration carries over for these conjunctive use projects, which I'm going to talk about next. So conjunctive use is kind of an expanded form of water transfers and in lieu recharge because it's more integrated. The water transfers are sort of a one-way system, the way we've been talking about them. Conjunctive use is much more dynamic, where you might have in the winter and spring, you might have several systems that are using mostly surface water and a little bit of groundwater, and then making sure that they have enough for ecosystem protection. But then in the summer and fall, when the surface water is less available, they might rely more heavily on their groundwater. And that can be really beneficial from an environmental standpoint because that surface water may be providing a lot of important habitat, rearing habitat for endangered species. So using a conjunctive use approach allows you to just optimize your water sources when they are most available. So the way this looks graphically, again, it's about reducing pumping because you're offsetting some of that pumping through using excess surface water when it's available. And that could, depending on where the pumping is taking place, that could benefit the Santa Margarita aquifer, it's much more likely to have a bigger impact if a large conjunctive use project was to be put in place that then offset some of the pumping in the Lompico. You might see a bigger impact there just because that is where most of the pumping in this basin is taking place. So as an evaluation, I really do want to point out that this is something that the San Lorenzo Valley Water District is doing already in their north system. So these are just 2 years here that I had for comparison. So in 2014, they used 900 acre feet of groundwater. And in 2017, remember, a very wet year, they only used 400. So you can see that's a significant amount of difference for that part of the basin. But how much you can expand it in that area is something that we need to evaluate. Project costs, again, it's somewhat lower. It's the same kind of cost that you would expect with water transfers, only you might have some additional pumping costs in the summer when you're trying to offset the surface water use. Again, there's a dependency on surface water. And here the amount of benefit to the basin really depends on the scale of the project and the location of the project and the partners involved. So there's lots of different ways that we could conceive of conjunctive use approaches. So you could potentially take some excess. San Lorenzo Valley Water District, for example, has the ability to use 313 acre feet a year from Loch Lomond. That water could be put into a conjunctive use project where it could offset some of their pumping in the South Basin, or say they end up with so much excess surface water some years that they give it some of that to Scotts Valley, or maybe the City of Santa Cruz Water Department comes in and is able to provide a lot of excess surface flow to this basin, knowing that in times of drought, they can take some of that water back through exchanges. So there's many different ways that this could be conceived of. Right now, the county and the San Lorenzo Valley Water District are working on a grant to evaluate expanding the use of this in the basin, really focused on their water needs and looking at the impacts it would have, particularly on stream flow to benefit fish. One thing to keep in mind with these is if you're going to be doing a project where you end up expecting that you're going to end up pumping more to offset some of the surface water that you'd be extracting normally in the fall, you really have to monitor that to make sure that the excess pumping that's going to take place isn't going to offset the benefits of the reduced pumping in the winter. Are there questions about that? I know it's starting to get a little more technical.
Any questions? And just as a reminder, I think it's fair to say that this concept of conjunctive use evaluation, while slightly different wording, is already captured in your guiding principles as a commitment you're hoping to pursue, the idea of an integrated water system across the basin. So this you've already expressed a principle related to this of commitment to try to make it happen.
Thank you, Dave. That's right. It's guiding principle number 14 talks about integrated water systems.
Yep. Okay, seeing no comments, let's proceed.
Okay. Next, we're going to talk about aquifer storage and recovery using surface water. So this is where projects start to get a little bit harder to conceptualize, but luckily the internet is full of these wonderful graphics, which I think do a really great job. So the way an aquifer storage and recovery ASR project works is essentially you have excess surface water during some times of the year. So most likely this would be winter and spring. But you have no place to put that surface water. It's all running out into the ocean. So you treat the water, you bring it up to drinking water standards, and then you inject it into the aquifer. There's a really important distinction here between this type of project and stormwater dry wells. In aquifer storage and recovery, you're taking treated water and you're injecting it directly into the aquifer. Whereas with stormwater, we were taking untreated water and putting it in the unsaturated zone. This is an active injection, so there's energy involved. And you can see basically the idea is that you put the water in when you have it, and then you can store it underground and pull it back out again when you need it. So the water is available for use in the summer. So the way this would likely pan out if we were to do ASR projects in this basin, most likely the projects would be focused in the Lompico aquifer, just because, again, this is where we have the most confinement and where we have the most space and where we have the most pumping from municipal sources, and actually the most pumping overall. I put some tiny arrows up in the Santa Margarita because, you know, we did do a small evaluation of the potential to do some aquifer storage and recovery up in the Quail Hollow or Olympia well fields as kind of a concept. So that is on the table, but it's really not it's not going to be a huge quantity of water. The bigger projects would be focused in the Lompico aquifer. So the way that would work, we put the water in. There we go, and we have increased groundwater levels in both aquifers, increased groundwater storage. And then if we did projects that benefited the Santa Margarita aquifer, then again, you could have that connection to improving the depletion of interconnected surface waters. All right, so let's talk about the evaluation of these projects. Again, there's more infrastructure involved in this type of project. You have to be able to move the water around. You have to be able to get it to and from your treatment plants, and then you have to be able to put it in the ground and then pull it back out again. So there's energy costs involved in that. And the project locations and the motivations behind the project do impact how this will relate to the sustainability management criteria. So what I mean by that is that a project that's being designed to be a water supply project, that's the #1 goal, is just to benefit water supply. They may only be putting as much water in the ground as they're then taking out later, in which case the basin is acting like a storage reservoir, which is really important for water supply security. But if they're not putting in more water than they're taking out, overall, it's not going to impact the average groundwater levels over time. I hope that made sense conceptually. So to really be able to see long-term upward trends of our sustainability management criteria, more water would need to be going into the ground than would be being pulled out. And again, this does rely on surface water, which may be a less reliable water source, but that's something that we would be including in our modeling for this. Are there any questions? This is a project where we really are talking much larger quantities of water, I think, than some of the other ones. So
Lou, let's go ahead. Lou Ferris, make sure you're unmuted.
Yes, thank you. ASR is getting a lot of attention for good reasons. It's got great potential. The problem that I see is I don't know of any or a lot of information regarding feasibility of how well it works. For example, I was going to some mid-county meetings last year, and they were drilling some test wells, I believe near Seascape Golf Course, actually injecting water into the wells and then trying to recover the water out of the wells. And the data they had then, which was pretty skimpy, was not looking good in terms of getting back out what you put in. I'm sure by now we have a lot more data about what's going on down in Soquel Creek Water District. A lot of the people that are on this JPA, we're working with Mid-County. Is there some way we can get our hands on the studies as far as the feasibility of ASR?
yeah, so I'll clear up a couple things, and then maybe I'll pass it on to Rosemary if she wants to add to this. But the aquifer storage and recovery project that's happening in the Mid-County Basin is in the Live Oak area in the belt system that the city of Santa Cruz operates. And they have been doing feasibility there. And as far as I understand it, the results have been actually quite encouraging. Rosemary, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So we did pilot testing at a well called Belts 12 last winter of 2018-19. And we did get some good results from that. And we started a pilot test process for wells further to the west, or I guess to the south. Never get the directions right down in there. But anyway, we did some further testing of a different well in the belt system called Belt 8 this last winter, but we only were able to do the first 2 of the 3 cycles. So that data is very preliminary. We are looking at, differences in the aquifers, but as Sierra said, there were some good results from the Belt 12 system that we had last year, and we do think that's a feasible project to pursue.
Thank you.
Well, if I may, my question still stands. Can we have that information available to at least the members of the agency or who are interested in looking at it, like myself?
So we do produce and provide to our Water Commission on a routine basis status reports. You can find them on the Water Commission agenda. I believe if Heidi's still on, she can talk a little bit about what's going to be in the agenda materials for the July 6th Water Commission meeting. But it's being produced and distributed on a routine basis. I'm sure there's a 500-page document that's the Belts 12 report, and I'm making 500 up, but I mean a very meaty document. So the answer is yes, it's available, and we can probably provide it. Just as, and I want to go back to since I'm talking, I might as well talk about this too. There was quite a bit of information that was developed between the city and Soquel Creek on the in lieu and the water quality issues related to the distribution system water quality changes from mixing surface water and groundwater. That information is also available. It's been presented publicly both at the Soquel Creek Board and at the Santa Cruz Water Commission. So those materials are available as well.
So the best place to go would be the Water Commission website, correct?
Yeah. We could probably direct you a little bit. Heidi, do you want to weigh in? Are you on the line still?
Heidi, you there? We do have a lineup in the queue, so I'm going to kind of ask if we could maybe follow up with Lou thereafter. I think that'd be more efficient. We've got Dale, Ruth, and then Doug in the queue, and we're already at 8:30. We're not done with this yet. We've still got other items to do. So let's go to, if we could go to Dale, please.
Hey, Sierra. So I know that the highest benefit for this would be to put more water into the aquifer than you're taking out, but wouldn't there still be a benefit to keeping the aquifer stable and not letting it decline and go down? Would that not also be a benefit?
Well, certainly, we absolutely don't want to allow the basin to decline, and projects like this wouldn't contribute to a decline, and they would contribute to water supply security, which is really important. But in terms of being able to achieve, you might be able to stay above the minimum thresholds, but you want to, we're trying to achieve more than that. We have kind of in our guiding principles, and as has been discussed tonight, we want to reach measurable objectives. And so it may be that projects have to be designed to do both. Like this is really just the beginning of the conversation. So, but I do think your point is really relevant, that I don't want to undervalue the importance of just water supply projects in this basin as well.
Okay, thanks.
Let's move on to Ruth and then Doug.
I have concerns with ASR, and I'm hearing an echo because I've got 2 machines going. My concerns with ASR are that we'd be injecting river water that's been treated to drinking water standards. So it would still have some PFOAS chemicals, some pharmaceuticals and personal care breakdown elements. And so I want to make sure that if we were to do that, we research it enough that we find out that that's not a significant problem.
Yeah, Ruth, I think that's a really important point, just to emphasize that the projects at the level that I'm describing them right now we just didn't have the time to go into any sort of detail into all of the feasibility assessments that would be part of this. But the water quality, the interactions of the surface water with the groundwater, making sure that there's no accumulation over time of anything concerning is something that would be part of the feasibility of these projects moving forward. So I think that's a really valuable point. It's also important to point out that the groundwater is already being heavily influenced by septic systems in the area, which may also contain some concerning contaminants over time. So I think that is a really relevant point and really important for the ongoing feasibility.
All right, so we had a comment and a withdrawal by Doug, but the Doug Engfer fan club is of Ethan Cassidy is demanding that Doug do an encore. So Doug, your fans await.
Oh, good Lord. Well, it was really just kind of building on the comments that Lou was making, in case other folks are interested. For a first order set of information about ASR work that's been done locally, look for the quarterly water supply augmentation strategy updates. They don't come on, the actual calendar quarter, but they come out every 3 months to the Water Commission, and staff produces a 20 to 30 page report on all the different strategies we're pursuing. I'd also comment that generally there's a pretty rich literature out there about ASR systems that have been implemented in other geographies that have worked, if you want to understand just more broadly about that. And then finally, staff prepared a pretty substantial foundation on which we're building the WSAS work about ASR, and that was about a year and a half or so ago. You'd have to dig back into the archives. Lou, if you want to send me an email, I can send you some pointers to make the search easier. But all this stuff's available on the city website.
Well, let me kind of go one step further on that. Not unlike Georgina has included in the front end of her presentation some background reading. I know Heidi just left the call, it looks like, but is it possible that as a part of the action item out of this meeting, perhaps Sierra, you and maybe Nick, or you and Nick and Heidi can just put together a quick primer of some of these types of locations that Doug is speaking about, and then we can share that globally to everybody. Obviously, the point of this is to use this as a springboard to do just this, help you all start educating yourself further on the costs and benefits of projects like these. So is that feasible?
Yes.
Okay, so Nick, if we could go ahead and make that an action item, Nick, and then that way we can move things along here, and we'll make sure that we get you, all of you, a collective sort of resources to go to should you want to.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Let's go ahead, Sarah, and move on, please.
All right, so the last of the tools in the toolbox that I'm going to talk about tonight is indirect potable reuse. What indirect potable reuse is, it's advanced treated wastewater. So there's these great little infographics that, again, I can't take credit for producing, but wastewater is typically treated to a secondary treatment level before it's sent out for disposal, in our case, into the ocean. When you hear about indirect potable reuse or recycled water for irrigation, it's tertiary treated, so it's treated one more time. If you're talking about potable water, that's an additional four levels of treatment above what is considered okay for, say, watering your crops. So it's highly treated recycled water. The reason it's called indirect potable reuse is because of this little circle here, this environmental buffer. So what this does is it creates a place where the person producing the water, so the agency producing the water, goes through the treatment system. It cleans it to that 7 different levels of treatment, and then it goes into either a surface water reservoir or a groundwater basin for at least a couple of months before it's then pulled back out again and put into the drinking water distribution system. There's also a thing called direct potable reuse. Right now, it's under review in California, but it's not currently permitted. So it's not something that we would put on our project list as an approach that we plan to implement. However, it doesn't mean that we couldn't keep it on maybe a group 3, something to consider in the future as things change if we don't reach sustainability doing what we are planning to do. If hopefully that was clear. So the way indirect potable reuse works, it's similar to ASR really, where you put the water in the ground and your groundwater levels will increase because of that. So unlike some of the other alternatives, this really is the only one that we're talking about that's kind of creating a quote unquote new source of water. There's no such thing as new water, but a newer source of water, which means it's a little bit less subject to climatic disruption. However, it's important to note that during droughts, people tend to conserve water, which means the stream of wastewater goes down. It would require a new treatment system or expanding the existing recycled water treatment system that Scotts Valley has, or working with Santa Cruz potentially. It requires new infrastructure. It has high ongoing energy costs because you have the energy cost to treat the water. You have the energy cost to move the water to where your well field is. Then you have to inject it into the ground and then you pull it back out again. So all of those things take energy. And the source water relies on sewered systems. So the San Lorenzo Valley is not on a source, so it's not a source of wastewater that could be utilized. The infrastructure in Scotts Valley or potentially Santa Cruz is where the wastewater would have to come from. And how the project is built and operated, again, this is similar to ASR. What the goals are, that will affect the relationship between the projects and the SMCs. So are you injecting, are you putting the water in the ground to improve groundwater levels, or are you putting the water in the ground for water supply reliability, or is it both? These are questions that would have to be evaluated moving forward. Okay, so that was my last that was actually my last tool. So are there any questions on this, on indirect potable reuse?
Chris, go ahead.
This is more of a comment. I went to a water reuse conference, and it was explained to me in a seminar that part of what the environmental buffer is, and this is with regards to pharmaceuticals and all the things that people are concerned about, is that they're just organic compounds, and the bacteria in the soil eats them. So the time that gets spent, that's why you want a certain period of time to keep it in the ground before you would take it back out again, because there is a natural purification system that goes on below the surface.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, any further questions?
I'll also point out, if we're going to be creating a list of resources related to the other project types, there's been a lot of work that's been undergone in the Soquel Creek Water District on their Pure Water SoCal project, which is exactly this, an indirect potable reuse project that's meant to generate 1,500 acre feet a year. So they've got a lot of resources available that we can also create links to if people have more questions about what a project like this could look like. Okay, so moving on to the next steps, and I feel like there's a lot of them, but really there's only a few. They're just really big next steps. So the first step is to continue doing what all of you have been working so hard on, which is to continue establishing these sustainability management criteria, because that is the what that we are trying to achieve with these projects. We're trying to achieve these sustainability management criteria. We need to complete the updating the groundwater model so that we can use it to evaluate these projects, the effectiveness of the types of projects that we're looking at, where they need to be to give us the most advantage where we need it the most, and how they can help us achieve these sustainability management criteria that you guys are working on setting right now. We need to obviously evaluate the costs, the energy use, the environmental factors, as we're trying to figure out how feasible are these projects. And this is actually kind of a complicated assessment, because a lot of these ideas have undergone various levels of feasibility assessment, but they've been done by different agencies at different time frames. So we need to make sure that as we're looking at these, we're really comparing, water quantities are being measured the same way. We're not having one person talk about billion gallons and another is talking about acre feet. We need to make sure that the dollars that are being compared are based on the same kind of year. Are we talking 2020 dollars? Are we talking 2050 dollars? And we need to make sure that all of the various costs are being incorporated the same way. Like, is all the infrastructure to move the water around being incorporated the same way in the different projects? So this is actually it could be kind of difficult work, but luckily we did include money in the grant that we recently received that's going to help us work with a consultant to do that evaluation. And then we're going to be working with all of you, all of the partner agencies, the board, the consultants, to really help figure out which projects are going to meet our sustainability criteria. And I wanted to put in a little graphic of how the model evaluation will go, because we don't obviously have any yet using the new updated model, but we do have this work that was done a few years ago using the previous iteration of the groundwater model, and it just shows you how we can compare these projects. So these are various scenarios being run under this groundwater model, and say we're adding 500 acre-feet a year into the basin under different climate scenarios. How does that impact our sustainability management criteria, basically? So this is the kind of thing that we'll be looking forward to seeing soon. And now the challenge is for future discussions, and I'm partly putting this up here because so you don't need to ask me these questions right now. So how much will the projects cost? How will the cost be allocated? Which of these PMAs and how many of them do we need to implement to meet our sustainability management criteria? Where will they be located? Who will own and manage the project? And who will conduct the ongoing operations and maintenance of these projects? These are all really, really important discussions that we are not quite ready to have yet because we haven't been able to do the evaluations. And then this is where I open it up to any further discussion. We'd really like to hear if you have any initial thoughts and concerns, and we've heard the ones that you've already mentioned. Do you have anything that you're particularly excited about? And if so, why? We're really interested in the why. And then, is there any other information that you really want us to have before we bring this back to you?
Okay, so Rosemary, let's go to you and then swing back around to the board, in particular these last questions regarding what would be helpful for us to bring back to you in addition to the citations and information we're going to be able to send to you. Rosemary, go ahead.
Sure. I just want to add one thing.
Can I just interrupt and make a suggestion?
Yeah.
When, as opposed to going through, we got these 3 questions here. Can we just please add that to the list of things that we will send comments to rather than go through it right now?
Fine with me.
Yeah, I think that sounds reasonable. So let's close out then with Rosemary, make that an action item, and then hand it back over to you, Chris, for the final remaining items for tonight. Rosemary, go ahead.
I just wanted to add one item to Sierra's list of the next steps, and that is to talk about and get agreement as an organization on the climate change scenarios we're going to be looking at. I know that some of that work is happening in the modeling, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what we really want to be talking about there.
All right, thank you.
Okay. All right, so we have an action item to memorialize these questions for action. Can we do the same as we've done on the other effort, the 2-week window? And Sierra, does that sound reasonable for you? A 2-week window for feedback?
That'd be perfect.
All right, so we'll make that as a 2-week window for folks. With that,
reminder on that? Quick comment there. Is it to Sarah directly, or would those questions be coming to Nick? Nick Walls also.
I'd assumed, consistent with our general protocols, it would go to Nick.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
And can we get a reminder on that in 2 weeks?
Well, it'll be due in 2 weeks, so maybe we can do a reminder in advance of that. So.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'll work it out.
All right, so I'm going to hand it back over to Chris as your chair to move us on to the final remaining items. Thank you to Sierra and to Georgina for really informative sessions, and to all of you for being so active throughout.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And yes, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Georgina, and thank you, everybody. 5, staff reports.
All right, so this one's actually me as well, I believe. There's only the one staff report, so this is so I don't want to take a lot of time describing it. You've seen the staff report. We are starting on the process to evaluate the surface water interactions, looking at the indicator, the depletion of interconnected surface water, which is, I really can't stress enough how complicated this is and how much work it's going to be for staff, and how much interest there is kind of around the state about what we and other basins in our situation where we have threatened and endangered species are, how we're going to approach this. So what staff is basically bringing forward is the formation of a technical advisory group to help us navigate through this, to bounce some of these ideas off of, to get input from technical experts who are familiar with our region and familiar with SIGMA, who might be able to give us ideas. And we would, of course, be bringing everything to the board in the in between meetings. We're talking probably 2 to 3 meetings. The first one would be likely in late July or early August, and then there might need to be another one subsequent to that, and then probably we'd have our final meeting after the model runs have been done and evaluated, so we could get feedback on that. You can see the list of agencies we want to include. What we're requesting is to have some board members participate in this technical advisory group. There's a lot of different reasons why I think it's valuable to have board members present at this kind of group, because one, you can hear directly the input from these technical advisors. You can provide your input so that they can hear your perspective. And then when we bring this back to the board, you can help staff kind of reiterate what was heard and what your impressions were. So because there are going to be staff and consultants from most of the member agencies already participating in the group through either helping run the meetings or being a participant in the meetings. We are recommending that we have 3 board members participate, and that they would be representatives from the Mount Hermon Association, the City of Scotts Valley, and one of the private well owner representatives, because they do not have staff or consultants who would be representing them at these meetings. So, is this up to Chris?
Okay.
You get to, I guess.
Yes. Okay. That sounds good. Okay, thank you, Sierra. We'll have to handle that appointment in the meeting. Because it's not agendized that we're going to do that, right?
If I could, Chris, this is Perrette, because it's not a committee, it is just a technical advisory group where 3 of the board members are invited. This would be an informational item unless the board feels they want to make it an action item. But our recommendation, the staff recommendation, is to move ahead, and we start meeting with this group, including the 3 members. That would be Dale Pollock, Jack Dillis, and Eden Cassidy.
That's fine. If we can do that, if that's allowed, that's fine by me.
Yes, that's all right.
I see there's a comment from Lou.
Chris, may I comment?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay. I think that forming the technical advisory group is a good idea. I have recommended that in the past. I would just like to see a little more information in regards to what you're planning on doing. I mean, you've talked about what you're going to do in the memo. You have not talked about how you're going to do it. And also, I think it would be helpful to see the exact makeup of the committee before we begin. And now, I'd like to know who exactly is going to be on this committee. You don't specifically lay out any names, just generalities.
Yeah, I can address that a little bit. the agencies have staff that are kind of their local staff members, but so those are the people I would reach out to. Each of these groups have, I would basically reach out to the representative who works in this area, with the exception of NOAA Fisheries, who has a specific person who focuses on SGMA. And I would ask them to choose the most appropriate staff person. So I have not reached out yet because I wanted to bring this to you all first. But I expect I probably know who most of the people are, but I don't have the finalized list, although that's something I could bring as an informational item at the next meeting.
I, for one, would like to see that.
Okay. And then as your there was another part to your question, wasn't there, about how we were going to do that? And the idea would be, you know, as I say in the staff report, we're really trying to get input from these people on our approach to the minimum thresholds and measurable objectives, and particularly the monitoring. So the idea would be that myself and Georgina and John Ricker and the consultants, John Fio for the San Lorenzo Valley Water District, and probably Perrette as well, would develop the agenda for the first meeting, or potentially 2 meetings, depending on how many things end up on the agenda. And the first one would be fairly introductory, and then we would probably end up getting into a lot of the procedural things in the second meeting, unless we could get it all done in one. And by that, I mean really addressing these sustainable management criteria. And then the final meeting would be really focused on the modeling and the monitoring.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right. If there's nothing else, anything from the public on that? Do we have public still on the?
Yeah, we still have a few callers here. Just one second. Okay, if you're calling in via telephone, you are unmuted. If you're calling in via the phone and you want to make a public comment, this is your opportunity to do so. Okay, hearing none.
Okay, thank you, Nick. We're gonna skip director's reports. We are going to future items, or what they look like. Informational items, there are none. Events calendar, we have 2 virtual events that I would encourage people to check out. And that takes me to number 10.
Move to adjourn.
Ah, who seconds that? All right. I'm gonna, everyone raise your hands if you're in favor. Okay. I'd like to thank everybody. That was an epic marathon. Well done. Everything was as good as it can be expected given the circumstances. Thank you all for working so hard. See you in the future.
Appreciate y'all coming out. See you next time.
Bye.